The Stork Prince, a tale of transformation and true love. A bedtime story in 15 chapters. Chapter 1. The Prophecy at the Springs. In a time when the desert winds carried whispers of ancient magic, there existed a prosperous Arabian kingdom nestled between golden dunes and life-giving oases. This land was ruled by a wise and generous sultan named Rashid, whose palace rose like a jeweled crown against the endless sky. Its towers gleamed with turquoise tiles, and its gardens bloomed with jasmine and roses that perfumed the air for miles around. Sultan Rashid and his beloved wife, Sultana Layla, were blessed with a son they named Amir. The young prince was everything parents could hope for, bright-eyed and curious, with a kindness that radiated from his smile. At 15, Amir had grown into a thoughtful young man who loved to ride his Arabian stallion through the palace grounds and spend hours in the royal library, studying the stars and ancient texts. The kingdom celebrated Amir's 15th birthday with great festivity. Silken banners rippled in the breeze, musicians filled the courtyards with melody, and the scent of spiced dishes wafted through every street. But amidst the joy, an old wanderer arrived at the palace gates, a mystic known throughout the land as Rashid the Seer. Rashid's face was weathered like ancient parchment, his eyes holding depths of knowledge accumulated over countless years. He requested an audience with the Sultan, and though it was unusual during a celebration, Sultan Rashid honored the request, for he respected wisdom wherever it appeared. In the quiet of the Sultan's private chamber, away from the festivities, Rashid spoke in a voice like wind through canyon stones. "Your Majesty, I come bearing a vision that troubled my meditations by the sacred springs. Your son stands at a crossroads of fate. Great trials await him. Trials that will test not just his courage but his very essence. He will lose himself to find his true self. He will fly before he can truly stand. And only through the power of selfless love will he return to who he is meant to be." Sultan Rashid felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "What manner of trials? How can I protect my son?" The seer shook his head slowly. "Some paths must be walked alone, Your Majesty. Some lessons can only be learned through transformation. But take heart. Though darkness will come, love shall be the light that guides him home. Watch for the coming of an envious shadow. Beware those who smile while harboring bitterness in their hearts." With these cryptic words, Rashid bowed and departed into the night, leaving Sultan Rashid deeply troubled. The Sultan stood at his window long after the mystic had gone, watching his son laugh with friends in the courtyard below, wondering what fate had in store for his beloved Amir. Sultana Layla found her husband there, his face etched with concern. When he shared the prophecy, she took his hand. "We cannot shield him from his destiny," she said softly, "but we can give him the strength to face it. We have raised him with love, wisdom, and courage. Whatever comes, he will not face it unprepared." That night, as the palace settled into peaceful slumber, none could know how soon the prophecy would begin to unfold. In his chamber, young Prince Amir dreamed of flying, soaring high above the palace on great wings, seeing his kingdom from heights he had never imagined. He woke with the dream vivid in his mind, his heart racing with an inexplicable mixture of excitement and unease. The morning sun rose over the kingdom, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, as it had for countless days before. But change was coming on silent wings, approaching like a shadow cast by something not yet visible in the sky. Chapter 2. The Feast and the Envious Guest. 3 months passed after the seer's visit, and life in the palace continued its graceful rhythm. The Sultan, though still mindful of the prophecy, found his concerns gradually easing as no obvious threat materialized. Perhaps, he thought, the trials spoken of were merely the ordinary challenges of growing into leadership that every prince must face. To strengthen alliances and celebrate the season of harvest, Sultan Rashid announced a grand feast, a gathering that would bring together nobles, merchants, scholars, and dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. For 7 days, the palace would host festivities showcasing the kingdom's prosperity and hospitality. The preparations were magnificent. Servants hung countless lanterns that would transform the palace gardens into a constellation of earthbound stars. Cooks prepared delicacies from across the known world: roasted lamb with pomegranate, saffron rice studded with pistachios, honey-soaked pastries layered thin as butterfly wings, and fruits carved into fantastic shapes. Prince Amir threw himself into the preparations with characteristic enthusiasm. He helped arrange entertainment, personally selecting poets and musicians he knew would delight the guests. His joy was infectious, and the palace staff worked with smiles, inspired by their young prince's genuine excitement. On the first evening of the feast, guests arrived in a glittering procession. Carriages adorned with precious metals brought nobles in their finest silks. Merchants displayed exotic wares in the palace's outer courtyards. The air hummed with conversation in a dozen languages, and everywhere there was laughter, music, and the clink of crystal goblets. Among the arriving guests was a figure who drew curious glances, a tall, angular man dressed in deep purple robes embroidered with silver symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. His name was Malachi, and he introduced himself as a scholar and collector of rare artifacts from distant lands. He carried himself with an air of sophistication, speaking eloquently on topics from astronomy to ancient poetry. Sultan Rashid, ever the gracious host, welcomed Malachi warmly, though something about the man's smile, too wide, too fixed, stirred a vague discomfort. Sultana Layla felt it too, though she couldn't name the source of her unease. Malachi presented elaborate gifts: a mechanical nightingale that sang with uncanny realism, an astrolabe of unprecedented precision, and a chess set carved from jade and obsidian. "For a kingdom that values both beauty and wisdom," he said with an elaborate bow. Throughout the evening, Malachi moved through the celebration like a dark thread woven through bright tapestry. He watched everything with eyes that missed no detail: the way servants hurried to fulfill requests, the deference shown to the Sultan's family, the affection the people clearly held for young Prince Amir. And as he watched, something cold and bitter grew in Malachi's heart. For Malachi was not merely a scholar, he was a sorcerer who had spent decades accumulating power and knowledge, yet had never known the simple warmth of being truly loved or the satisfaction of ruling justly. He had traveled from kingdom to kingdom, always observing, always envying those who possessed what he could not claim through magic or manipulation. This kingdom, with its happiness and harmony, its beloved sultan and cherished prince, represented everything Malachi despised because he could never possess it. Here was a young prince who had been given everything: love, respect, a kingdom's devotion, simply by birthright, while Malachi had scraped and schemed for every scrap of recognition he'd ever received. On the third night of the feast, Malachi approached Prince Amir, who stood on a balcony overlooking the gardens, taking a moment of solitude from the crowds. "A beautiful view, young prince," Malachi said smoothly. "You must feel blessed to call all this your home." Amir turned with a genuine smile. "I do feel blessed, though I hope to prove worthy of it. My father says that privilege must be balanced with responsibility." "Wise words," Malachi replied, his smile tightening. "Tell me, Have you ever wondered what lies beyond these palace walls, beyond the comfortable life you've always known? Often, Amir admitted, I hope one day to travel, to understand my father's allies and neighbors, to see the world beyond the kingdom's borders. Travel opens one's eyes, Malachi said thoughtfully, but sometimes the greatest journeys are not measured in distance. Sometimes we must become something entirely different to truly understand ourselves. Amir laughed, not catching the darkness underlying the words. That sounds like something our court philosopher would say, very mysterious and meaningful. Malachi's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes had grown cold. Some mysteries reveal themselves in time, young prince, in time. As the feast continued over the following days, Malachi's envy deepened into something darker, a resolve to shatter the perfect life he witnessed. On the final night, as fireworks painted the sky with brilliant colors and the celebration reached its joyous peak, Malachi slipped away to a quiet corner of the palace gardens. There, beneath an ancient fig tree, he drew out a small vial of shimmering liquid, a potion crafted from rare ingredients gathered over many years, infused with powerful transformation magic. He spoke an incantation in a language older than the kingdom itself, words that tasted of bitterness and revenge. The spell rose into the night sky like invisible smoke, seeking its target, waiting for the precise moment to strike. Malachi smiled, a real smile this time, sharp and satisfied. Let the privileged prince learn what it means to lose everything, he whispered. Let him know the isolation I have always felt. Let him fly far from this perfect life and discover if he has the strength to find his way back. As the feast concluded and guests departed over the following day, Sultan Rashid felt relieved that the celebration had passed without incident. The seer's prophecy seemed more distant than ever, but neither he nor anyone in the palace knew that the envious guest had left behind something far more dangerous than his elaborate gifts, a curse that waited like a patient predator for the perfect moment to strike. Chapter 3. The Curse and the Transformation. The week following the feast, life in the palace settled back into its comfortable rhythm. Prince Amir resumed his studies with renewed energy, his mind full of the fascinating conversations he'd had with scholars and travelers during the celebration. He spent his mornings with tutors learning statecraft and diplomacy, his afternoons practicing swordsmanship and horsemanship, and his evenings in the royal library, where ancient texts spoke of distant lands and fantastic creatures. It was during one of these quiet evening hours that the curse finally struck. Amir had dismissed his attendance, preferring solitude as he pored over an illustrated manuscript describing the migration patterns of birds across the desert. The library was peaceful, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the towered shelves. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep purple. As Amir turned a page showing a detailed drawing of a stork in flight, he felt a strange tingling sensation in his fingers. He looked down and gasped. His hands seemed to shimmer, their solidity becoming uncertain. Before he could call out, the sensation spread up his arms and throughout his body. Panic flooded through him as he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond properly. The room suddenly seemed to be growing larger, or he was becoming smaller. His elegant robes pooled around him as his body diminished. His arms lengthened and lightened, skin becoming feather, bone becoming hollow. His face extended into a long, pointed beak. His cry for help emerged as a harsh, bird-like call that echoed strangely in the vast library. The transformation lasted only moments but felt like an eternity. When it ended, Prince Amir stood on the library floor as a white stork with black wingtips, elegant and tall for a bird, but impossibly small compared to his human form. His discarded clothes lay around him like collapsed tents. Terror and confusion overwhelmed him. He tried to speak, but could only produce stork cries. He tried to reach for a book, but his wings couldn't grasp anything. He stumbled on his new legs, unused to their backward-bending joints and strange proportions. "What's happening to me?" his mind screamed. "This can't be real. It must be a nightmare. I'll wake up. I must wake up." But he didn't wake up, because it wasn't a dream. The curse Malachi had woven had found its moment. A moment when Amir was alone, vulnerable, and unprepared. The sorcerer's magic had transformed the prince into the very bird he'd been studying, binding him in feathers and beak. As Amir struggled to understand his new form, he heard footsteps approaching the library. His heart, now a tiny, racing bird heart, filled with hope someone was coming. They would help him. They would understand somehow. A servant entered to light additional lamps for the evening. She hummed softly as she went about her work. Not immediately noticing the bird among the prince's discarded clothes, Amir called out, a loud, desperate stork cry. The servant turned, saw him, and her eyes widened. "What? How did a bird get in here?" She noticed the prince's clothes, and her expression shifted to confusion, then concern. "Where is Prince Amir? These are his robes." She hurried to the clothes, examining them with growing alarm. Amir hopped toward her, crying out again, trying desperately to communicate that he was here. He was the bird. Something terrible had happened. But the servant saw only a wild bird in the library, acting strangely. "Shoo! Go on!" She waved her hands at him. "You shouldn't be in here. How did you even get inside?" More servants arrived, drawn by the commotion. Then guards. Then, finally, Sultan Rashid and Sultana Layla themselves, their faces tight with worry. "My son's clothes are here, but he's nowhere to be found," a guard reported. "The library has been searched thoroughly." Amir's parents stood in the center of the library, holding their son's empty robes, and the anguish on their faces broke what remained of Amir's human heart. His mother was weeping. His father's strong shoulders slumped with devastation. "Search the entire palace," the Sultan commanded. "Search the grounds. Search the city. Find my son." As guards dispersed and the search began, no one paid attention to the white stork that perched on a high shelf, its head bowed, its spirit crushed by the realization that no one recognized him. To everyone he loved, he had simply vanished. To everyone who loved him, he was gone. The curse had done more than change his form. It had stolen his identity, his voice, his place in the world. He was no longer Prince Amir. He was just a bird, as insignificant and unrecognized as any wild creature that might wander into human spaces. That night, as the palace filled with searching torches and desperate voices calling, "Prince Amir, Prince Amir," the stork that had been the prince huddled in the darkness of the library's highest shelf. He had tried repeatedly to transform back, willing his body to return to its human shape, but nothing happened. Whatever magic bound him was beyond his power to break. Through the library's window, he could see the stars, the same stars he'd studied in human form, naming their constellations and calculating their movements. They looked different now, seen through bird eyes, but they were the same stars. The same universe, the same world he'd known yesterday, but he was not the same. And as the reality of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket, Prince Amir, now just a stork, realized that everything had changed. The comfortable life he'd known, the future he'd anticipated, the person he'd been, all of it was gone. The seer's words came back to him. He will lose himself to find his true self. He will fly before he can truly stand. In his new form, Amir wept tears that birds don't normally cry, mourning for everything he'd lost, terrified of what lay ahead, and completely alone in a way he'd never imagined possible. The curse was complete. The first trial had begun. Chapter 4. First Days in New Feathers. The first rays of dawn found the stork that had been Prince Amir still perched on the library shelf, exhausted from a sleepless night of grief and confusion. Below, servants moved quietly through the palace, their faces drawn with worry. The search for the missing prince had continued through the night without success. As sunlight streamed through the tall windows, Amir felt an unfamiliar stirring in his new body, instincts that weren't his own, yet somehow were his bird eyes, sharper than his human ones had ever been, were drawn to the brightening sky visible through the window. Something deep and primal urged him toward it, toward the open air and freedom of flight. But flight terrified him. He was a prince, not a bird. He'd never flown in his life. What if he fell? What if he hurt himself? What if... A guard entered the library, and Amir's bird instincts made the decision his human mind hesitated over. Without conscious thought, his wings spread wide, surprisingly wide, and he launched himself from the shelf. For a heart-stopping moment he plummeted, but then his wings caught the air and he was gliding, swooping, adjusting without knowing how he knew to adjust. He flew through the open window and out into the morning sky. The sensation was indescribable. Terror and exhilaration mixed as Amir beat his wings, climbing higher above the palace. The world spread out beneath him in a way he'd never experienced. The palace gardens laid out like an intricate carpet, the city beyond with its winding streets and bustling morning markets, the desert stretching endlessly to the horizon. He circled the palace, drawn to it yet unable to return to it. Not like this. Below he could see his parents on a balcony, his mother's face pale and strained, his father's arm around her shoulders. They were looking out at the city, searching for any sign of their son, and Amir flew lower, calling out to them. But his call was just a stork's cry, and they didn't look up. The flight muscles in his chest began to burn. He wasn't used to this exertion. Awkwardly, Amir descended to the palace courtyard, landing with an ungraceful stumble that would have been comical if it weren't so pathetic. Several servants glanced at him but paid no real attention. He was just a bird, nothing important. Hunger gnawed at him. Another new sensation, his bird body needed fuel, and it needed it urgently. But what did storks eat? The thought made him queasy, but his instincts knew what his mind refused to accept. He found himself drawn to the palace fountains where fish swam in decorative pools. No, his human mind rebelled. I can't. I won't. But his body acted on its own, his beak darting into the water with surprising speed, emerging with a small fish that he swallowed before his conscious mind could fully process what was happening. The sensation was disturbing and satisfying at once. This is what I am now, he thought with despair. This is what I've become. Over the following days, Amir struggled to survive in his new form. Each day brought fresh challenges and small, hard-won victories. He learned to trust his wings, to ride thermals that carried him higher with less effort. He discovered which foods his body could tolerate. Not just fish, but frogs from the palace gardens, insects, and small creatures that his human self would have found revolting. He learned the hard way about predators. On his third day, a hawk dove at him while he rested on a wall, and only his panicked, instinctive dive saved him. He learned to be constantly alert, to never fully relax, to see threats in every shadow. The palace cats, which he'd once found amusing, were now genuinely dangerous dogs that had once greeted him with wagging tails, now barked and chased him. The entire world had shifted from welcoming to hostile. But perhaps the hardest lesson was learning to be invisible. He watched from rooftops and trees as his parents grew more haggard with worry. He saw his mother weeping in the garden where they'd often walked together. He watched his father sitting alone in the throne room, holding his head in his hands, looking older than Amir had ever seen him. Wanted notices were posted throughout the kingdom, rewards were offered. Searchers combed every street, every building, every possibility. But no one looked at the white stork that perched on the palace walls. No one imagined that the missing prince might be right there, watching them search, desperate to reveal himself but trapped in a form that made communication impossible. Amir tried everything he could think of to show his identity. He arranged stones in the garden to spell his name, but servants swept them away as random debris. He tried to lead his parents to the library where his clothes still lay, but they thought he was just a persistent bird and shooed him away. He attempted to perform tasks only Prince Amir would know to do, but birds' bodies aren't made for opening doors or handling objects, and his efforts appeared as nothing more than the random movements of wildlife. The frustration was maddening. He was right here, but he might as well have been on the other side of the world for all the good it did. 2 weeks after his transformation, Amir perched on the palace walls at sunset, watching the daily life of his home continue without him. The realization settled over him with crushing finality. He couldn't stay here. His presence only caused him pain, and he could do nothing to ease his parents' suffering. He was no longer Prince Amir of this palace. He was a stork. And storks weren't meant to live in palaces. The instincts that had been growing stronger within him whispered of other places, of wetlands and rivers where storks gathered, of migrations and journeys written into his new body's very bones. Part of him resisted. Leaving felt like giving up, like abandoning hope of ever returning to his true form. But another part of him, the part that had learned to fly and hunt and survive, knew the truth. If there was any chance of breaking this curse, he wouldn't find it here. Watching helplessly as his family grieved, the seer had spoken of trials, of transformation, of finding himself. Perhaps he needed to truly accept what he'd become before he could return to what he'd been. That night, under a crescent moon, Amir made his decision. At dawn, he would leave the palace, leave the city, leave behind everything familiar. He would learn to truly live as a stork, to embrace this form completely, and perhaps, somewhere in that acceptance, he would find the key to breaking the curse. He didn't know that this was exactly what Malachi had intended, for the prince to lose not just his form, but his very identity, to be so completely cast out from his life that finding his way back would seem impossible. As Amir settled into an uncomfortable sleep on the palace walls, the stars wheeled overhead. The same stars he'd studied as a prince, now witnesses to his transformation into something he'd never imagined becoming tomorrow. His true journey would begin. Chapter 5. Farewell to Home. Dawn broke over the palace with exceptional beauty, as if nature itself wanted to make Amir's departure even more bittersweet. The sky blazed with colors, deep purple fading to rose, then gold, then the brilliant blue of full morning. Amir had watched countless sunrises from his palace window, but this was the first he'd experienced with a bird's keen vision, and despite everything, he couldn't help but marvel at the intensity of colors he'd never quite seen before. He had spent much of the night on the eastern wall, and now, as the palace began to wake below him, he felt the weight of what he was about to do. This wasn't just leaving home. It was accepting exile from the only life he'd known, from everyone he loved, just once more, he thought. I need to see them one more time. Amir glided down from the wall to a balcony outside his parents' chambers. Through the latticed screens, he could see his mother sitting at her dressing table, but she wasn't preparing for the day. She was simply sitting, staring at nothing, her beautiful face marked by sleepless nights and endless tears. His father entered the chamber, and Amir watched as Sultan Rashid approached his wife, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. "Layla, my heart, you must eat something. You must rest." "How can I rest when our son is missing?" Sultana Layla's voice was hoarse. "Every moment I close my eyes, I imagine him in danger, calling for us, wondering why we haven't found him. I have sent searchers to every corner of the kingdom and beyond," the Sultan said, his own voice thick with anguish. "I have consulted every wise person, every mystic, every—" He stopped, and Amir saw realization cross his father's face. The seer, the prophecy. Rashid spoke of trials. Sultana Layla remembered, turning to face her husband. He said Amir would lose himself to find his true self. Could this disappearance be part of whatever he foresaw? The Sultan finished grimly. But he also said our son would need great strength to overcome what awaited him. "Layla, we must have faith that we raised him well enough, gave him enough love and wisdom to face whatever this is. But what if he's alone and frightened? What if he thinks we've abandoned him?" "Amir knows we would never abandon him," Sultan Rashid said firmly, though tears glistened in his eyes. "Wherever he is, whatever has happened, he knows he is loved. That knowledge will be his anchor." On the balcony, the stork that was their son felt his heart breaking anew. "I'm here," he tried to say. "I'm right here, and I know you love me. I've never doubted it for a moment." But only a soft stork call emerged, and neither parent heard it. Sultana Layla stood and embraced her husband, and they held each other in shared grief. "I won't stop searching," she whispered. "Even if it takes the rest of my life, I will find our son." "We will find him," the Sultan agreed, "together." Amir couldn't bear to watch anymore. He launched himself from the balcony, his vision blurred by tears that shouldn't be possible for a bird, but somehow were. He flew erratically, careening through the palace gardens one final time. He passed the training grounds where he'd learned swordsmanship, the stables where his horse, beautiful Zahir, was being fed by a groom who also looked sad and distracted. Did even the animals miss him? He passed the library where his transformation had occurred, its windows now closed. He passed the garden fountain where his mother loved to sit in the evenings, and the courtyard where he'd celebrated his last birthday just months ago. Every corner held memories. Every stone knew his footsteps. Every tree had given him shade. This palace had been his whole world, and now he was leaving it, not knowing if he would ever return. He circled higher, wanting one last view to carry with him. The palace spread below, like a beautiful dream. Its turquoise domes, its intricate gardens, its walls that had always meant safety and home. Beyond it, the city where his people lived, where merchants called their wares, and children played in the streets, and life continued even as his had been torn apart. "Goodbye," he thought to it all. "Goodbye, Father. Goodbye, Mother. I don't know where I'm going or how long I'll be gone, but I promise I'll find a way back to you somehow. Someday." The morning sun was fully risen now, and Amir felt the urge to fly, to move, to begin whatever journey lay ahead. He oriented himself to the south, where his bird instincts whispered of wetlands and rivers, of places where storks gathered and thrived. With one final cry, a sound of farewell that no one in the palace would understand, Amir beat his wings and flew toward the horizon. The palace grew smaller behind him, then the city, then even the familiar landscape of his kingdom. Within an hour, He was flying over terrain he'd never seen except on maps. Rocky hills giving way to scrubland, then sandy expanses marked by the occasional oasis. The physical act of flying for such distances was exhausting in a way his princely body had never experienced. His wing muscles burned, his chest heaved with effort, and his hollow bones felt somehow heavy despite their lightness. He had to stop frequently to rest, perching on rock outcroppings or the rare trees that survived in this harsh landscape. During one such rest, as he stood on a sun-baked stone catching his breath, Amir heard a sound that chilled him, a harsh, laughing call from above. He looked up to see 3 ravens circling, their black forms stark against the blue sky. One of them dove toward him, and Amir barely managed to take flight before sharp talons would have struck him. The ravens chased him, seeming to take pleasure in his panic. He flew desperately, zigging and zagging, his exhaustion making him clumsy. Just when he thought he couldn't evade them any longer, he spotted a narrow crevice in a rocky cliff face and dove for it, squeezing into the tight space. The ravens couldn't follow, and after a few frustrated passes they flew away, their laughter-like calls echoing off the rocks. Amir huddled in the crevice, trembling. This was his life now, running from predators, constantly afraid, fighting to survive each day. The contrast with his former existence was so extreme, it felt surreal. Just weeks ago, his biggest concern had been mastering a difficult passage in his diplomatic studies. Now he was hiding in a rock crack, terrified of being killed by ravens. Is this what the curse was meant to do, he wondered, to strip away everything I was until nothing remains? But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, something else stirred in Amir's heart, something stubborn and resilient. He was still himself. The form might have changed, the circumstances might be impossible, but his core, his mind, his will, his spirit remained. He was still Prince Amir, son of Sultan Rashid and Sultana Layla. He had been raised with love and taught to face challenges with courage. I will survive this, he vowed silently. I will learn what I need to learn, endure what I need to endure, and I will find my way back. This curse won't defeat me. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Amir emerged from his hiding place and resumed his journey. He flew with more determination now, his wings finding a rhythm, his body adapting to the demands being placed upon it. The palace was far behind him, out of sight and soon to be out of reach for days or weeks of flying. But he carried it with him, in his memories, in his heart, in the love that anchored him even as he flew into unknown skies. The first chapter of his exile had closed. The next was just beginning, and somewhere far ahead, in a kingdom he didn't yet know existed, a princess he had never met was about to encounter something that would change her life forever, though neither of them knew it yet. Chapter 6. Journey Along the Shores. For 3 weeks, Amir flew southward, following the ancient pathways that seemed coded into his stork body's very being. He learned to read the land from above, recognizing the signs of water, the green threads of vegetation that marked rivers, the dark patches that indicated lakes or marshes. Water meant food, rest, and relative safety. His body was changing, adapting. The soft prince who had never known real physical hardship was being forged into something leaner and stronger. His wing muscles developed, making flight easier. His reflexes sharpened. His senses expanded into ranges he'd never known humans couldn't access. He could see ultraviolet patterns on flowers, detect the faintest movements in grass that signaled prey, feel changes in air pressure that warned of coming storms. But the most surprising change was the community he discovered. Storks, he learned, weren't solitary creatures. He first encountered others of his kind at a wide, slow-moving river lined with papyrus reeds. As he descended weary from a long day's flight, he saw dozens of white storks wading in the shallows, their long legs moving gracefully through the water, their beaks darting to catch fish and frogs. Amir landed awkwardly. He still wasn't graceful at it, and immediately several storks turned toward him. He tensed, unsure what to expect, but their response wasn't aggressive. They seemed curious, evaluating, and after a moment they returned to their fishing, accepting his presence. Over the following days, Amir learned the unspoken language of stork society. There were hierarchies based on age and strength, preferred fishing spots that had to be respected, and subtle communications through posture and movement that conveyed everything from warnings to welcomes. One older stork, his feathers slightly grayed with age, seemed to take an interest in Amir. The old bird, Amir thought of him as elder, though of course he had no way of knowing the creature's actual name, demonstrated techniques for fishing in different types of water. When Amir struggled, Elder would show him again, patient in a way that reminded Amir achingly of his own father's teaching methods. Through Elder, Amir discovered something profound. Intelligence existed in forms he'd never imagined. The old stork couldn't speak, couldn't reason the way humans did, but he possessed a deep wisdom about the world, about weather patterns, about the movements of fish, about the safest routes to fly, and the best places to rest. This was knowledge accumulated over many years and many migrations, knowledge that couldn't be written in books, but was no less valuable. Amir found himself wondering, how many times had he, as a prince, dismissed animals as simple creatures, inferior to humans? How much intelligence and complexity had he overlooked because it didn't express itself in human ways? As the weeks passed and Amir migrated with his newfound flock, he encountered other species and learned from them too. A clever hoopoe bird showed him where insects gathered in greatest abundance. A patient heron demonstrated a different fishing technique, standing so still that fish forgot to fear him. Even the small plovers that ran along beaches taught him lessons about finding tiny crustaceans hidden in sand. One evening, as the flock settled to roost in tall trees beside a lake, Amir experienced something he hadn't felt since his transformation, a sense of belonging. These birds didn't know he was a prince. They didn't care about his title or his heritage. They accepted him simply as another stork, one who was learning and adapting and earning his place in their community through his actions, not his birthright. There was something freeing in that anonymity, even as it was also lonely. For the first time in his life, Amir had to prove his worth through what he did rather than who he was, and surprisingly, he found he could do it. He might have been raised in a palace, but the character his parents had instilled in him, determination, courage, willingness to learn, served him well even in this impossible situation. But not everything about the journey was peaceful. Nature was beautiful, but also harsh and unforgiving. During a storm that struck suddenly one afternoon, Amir found himself separated from the flock, blown off course by winds that tossed him like a leaf. Rain lashed at him, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. Lightning split the sky terrifyingly close. He flew desperately, seeking any shelter, but the flat marshland offered none. A lightning bolt struck a tree just ahead of him, and the shock wave knocked him tumbling through the air. For a terrifying moment he lost control entirely, spinning helplessly as the ground rushed up. At the last second his instincts took over, and he managed to spread his wings, converting his fall into a crash landing in thick mud. He lay there, stunned and gasping as the storm raged around him. The mud was cold and sucking, and he struggled to pull himself toward firmer ground. Every movement was exhausting. His wings felt heavy as stones. For the first time since leaving the palace, Amir genuinely wondered if he would die here, alone in the mud, his body never found, his parents never knowing what happened to him. No, he told himself fiercely. No, I will not give up. I will not let this curse win. With every ounce of strength he possessed, Amir dragged himself out of the mud and onto a patch of reeds that provided minimal shelter. He huddled there through the endless night as the storm gradually blew itself out, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but his will unbroken. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright. Amir's body ached in ways he didn't know were possible, but he was alive. And as the sun warmed his bedraggled feathers, he felt something unexpected: pride. He had survived a trial that would have killed the pampered prince he'd been. He was becoming something stronger, something tested. Over the following weeks, Amir continued his journey, and with each day, the skills that had seemed impossible became natural. He could now spot fish from great heights, dive precisely to catch them, and swallow them without the disgust he'd initially felt. He could read weather signs in clouds and wind. He could find safe roosting spots by instinct. He could fly for hours without exhausting himself. The stork body that had seemed like a prison was becoming, in some strange way, a kind of home. Not a replacement for his human form, never that, but something he could inhabit with increasing competence and even occasional appreciation. There was joy in a perfect flight, in soaring on thermals so high that the world became abstract patterns below. There was satisfaction in a successful hunt. There was peace in the simple routines of bird life: fly, eat, rest, sleep, repeat. But always, beneath everything, Amir remained himself. At night, when he roosted with the other storks, he would gaze at the stars and remember his human life. He would think of his parents, hoping they hadn't given up on finding him. He would wonder about the curse. What would break it? How would he know when he'd completed the trials the seer had spoken of? And increasingly, he wondered, what was he meant to learn from all this? There had to be a purpose beyond simple suffering. The seer had said he would lose himself to find his true self. What did that mean? As the flock continued its migration, following routes older than any kingdom, Amir didn't know that his journey was about to take a crucial turn. Ahead lay a destination he hadn't chosen, but that fate had selected for him: a kingdom by the sea, with gardens that touched the water's edge. And in those gardens, a princess walked alone, contemplating her own questions about identity, purpose, and the path her life should take. The threads of two very different fates were about to intersect, though neither soul yet suspected it. Chapter 7. Trial of Hunger and Storm. The coastal wetlands where Amir's flock had settled seemed like paradise after the harsh desert he'd crossed. The marsh stretched for miles, its waters teeming with fish, frogs, and countless insects. Salt and fresh water mixed here, creating a rich ecosystem where hundreds of bird species gathered. The air hummed with life. For a week, Amir thrived. He'd become so proficient at fishing that he often caught more than he needed. The other storks had fully accepted him, and he'd found a comfortable rhythm to his days. He even began to relax slightly, the constant vigilance required for survival easing just a bit. That was when nature reminded him that comfort was an illusion. It started with the fish. One morning, Amir noticed that the shallows where he usually hunted were nearly empty. He moved to a different spot, then another, but everywhere the fish seemed to have vanished. The other storks noticed too, and soon the entire flock was ranging farther and farther from their roosting site, searching for adequate food. It's just a bad day, Amir told himself. Tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow wasn't better. Nor was the day after that. Some quirk of tide or temperature or seasonal change had driven the fish into deeper waters where the storks couldn't reach them. The frogs had also become scarce, as if sensing some change in the environment that the birds couldn't detect. Amir's stomach cramped with hunger, unlike anything he'd experienced. As a prince, he'd never known real hunger. Meals had appeared regularly, abundant and delicious. He'd sometimes delayed eating for his studies or activities, but he'd always known food was available whenever he wanted it. This was different. This was day after day of inadequate food, of catching just enough to barely sustain himself, of going to sleep with his stomach aching and waking to face another day of desperate searching. His body, which had been growing stronger, began to weaken. He could feel himself becoming lighter, his breastbone more prominent, his energy flagging. The other storks were suffering too. Elder, the older bird who had befriended him, was especially struggling. Age and hunger were a dangerous combination. Amir tried to help when he could, alerting Elder to food sources he found, but there was barely enough for himself, let alone to share. On the 5th day of severe hunger, as Amir stood in shallow water, swaying slightly with weakness, he watched Elder hunt nearby. The old stork moved more slowly than usual. His strikes less accurate, Amir saw him miss an easy catch, then another. The old bird's strength was failing. A wave of compassion swept through Amir. This stork had helped him when he was awkward and ignorant. Elder had taught him, shown patience, made a place for him in the flock. How could he stand by and watch him starve? When Amir caught his next fish, a reasonable-sized one that his body desperately needed, he found himself flying to Elder instead of swallowing it. He dropped the fish near the old stork, calling softly. Elder looked at him with an expression that, even across species, conveyed understanding and gratitude. The old bird ate the fish, and Amir flew away to hunt again, his own stomach cramping with hunger, but his heart somehow fuller. It was a small act, born of compassion rather than calculation, and Amir didn't think much of it at the time. He didn't know that such acts, small moments of selflessness, of putting another's needs before his own, were precisely the kind of character building the curse required. Malachi had wanted to destroy him. But each trial that didn't break Amir only made him stronger and more worthy. The hunger might have eventually eased, giving the storks time to adapt or migrate to better feeding grounds. But before that could happen, the storm arrived. It came from the sea, rolling in with a fury that made the previous storm Amir had experienced seem like a gentle rain. The sky turned greenish-black, a color Amir had learned meant serious danger. The wind began to howl across the marsh, bending the reeds flat and churning the water into froth. The flock took to the air, instinct driving them to seek shelter inland, away from the worst of the storm's fury. But they were weak from days of hunger, and the wind was stronger than anything Amir had encountered. It didn't just push against him. It played with him, flipping him sideways, dropping him in sudden downdrafts, then lifting him in violent updrafts that left him disoriented. Rain came in horizontal sheets, so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet. Lightning cracked continuously, the thunder so loud and constant it was like being trapped inside a drum. The temperature dropped rapidly, and soon Amir's wet feathers provided no insulation against the cold. He lost sight of the other storks within minutes. He was alone in a maelstrom, fighting just to stay airborne, his exhausted wings screaming with effort, his weakened body pushed far beyond its limits. The wind grabbed him and threw him, and he tumbled through the air, wings flailing uselessly. He slammed into something, a tree, maybe, or a cliff face, and the impact knocked what little breath he had from his lungs. He fell, spinning, until he crashed into water. Cold salt water closed over him, and for a disorienting moment, he didn't know which way was up. Panic gave him a burst of energy. He thrashed, found the surface, gasped for air, but the waves were tremendous, tossing him around like debris. Each time he tried to take flight, the wind or a wave knocked him down again. Salt water filled his beak and throat, making him choke and gag. "I'm going to die here," he realized with surprising clarity. After everything, the transformation, the exile, the learning to survive, I'm going to drown in this storm. The thought of his parents flashed through his mind. They would never know what happened to him. They would spend the rest of their lives wondering, hoping, grieving for a son whose body they'd never find. The thought was more painful than the physical agony of drowning. "I'm sorry," he thought. Whether to them or to himself or to fate itself, he didn't know. "I tried. I really tried." But just as his strength was finally failing, just as he was sinking below the surface for what felt like the final time, something grabbed him, not attacked, grabbed. Talons closed around his body, but carefully, not piercing. He felt himself being lifted from the water, pulled up and up through the storm. Through his blurred vision, Amir caught a glimpse of his rescuer, a huge owl, its wingspan far greater than his own, its powerful wings managing the storm with a capability Amir couldn't match. The owl carried him through the wind and rain, fighting through the weather with grim determination. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the owl descended, bringing them to a massive hollow in an ancient tree, sheltered from the worst of the storm. The owl deposited Amir carefully on the dry wood inside the hollow, then settled near the entrance, blocking most of the wind and rain with its substantial body. Amir lay there gasping, shaking, too exhausted and shocked to even feel gratitude yet. He was alive. Impossibly, incredibly, he was alive. The storm raged outside, but inside the hollow there was relative peace. As Amir's breathing slowly normalized and the shaking subsided to occasional tremors, he became aware of the owl watching him with large luminous eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. And then, impossibly, the owl spoke. Not in human language, but Amir understood anyway, the meaning coming through in a way that bypassed normal speech. "You are far from home, little prince." Amir's heart nearly stopped. The owl knew. Somehow, this creature knew who he really was. "Don't be alarmed," the owl continued, its voice like wind through canyon stones. "I am Athena, and I am very old. Old enough to recognize transformation magic when I see it. Old enough to know that some curses can be broken, and some cannot. Yours, young one, can be broken. But the key lies not in returning to who you were, but in becoming who you were meant to be." "How?" Amir tried to ask, but only Stork sounds emerged. The owl seemed to understand anyway. "Love," she said simply, "not the love you've known, the comfortable, certain love of family, a different love, a love that must be earned and given freely. A love that sees you, truly sees you, and chooses you anyway. When you find that, when you give that, the curse will have no more power." "But how will I know?" Amir's stork cry was desperate. "How will I find it?" "You won't find it," Athena said. "It will find you. Your task is to remain open to it, to remain yourself despite everything that's happened. The curse sought to destroy your spirit, to make you bitter and hard and closed. Every moment you choose kindness over cruelty, compassion over indifference, hope over despair, you weaken the curse. Continue as you have been, little prince. Trust the journey." The owl settled more comfortably, her presence radiating a calm that eased Amir's racing heart. "Rest now," she said. "The storm will pass, and when it does, continue your journey south. There is a kingdom by the sea where gardens meet the waves. That is where your next chapter will unfold." Amir wanted to ask more questions, so many questions, but exhaustion was overwhelming him. His eyes, heavy as stones, refused to stay open. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt the owl's presence like a benediction, a promise that he wasn't alone, that his struggle had meaning, that there was hope. "Thank you," he managed, the words emerging as a soft trill. "You're welcome, Prince Amir," the owl replied. "Now sleep. Tomorrow everything changes." And in the shelter of the ancient tree, with the storm raging outside and a mystical owl standing guard, the prince who had been transformed into a stork slept deeply for the first time since his curse began, cradled by hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a path back to himself after all. Chapter 8. Saved by the Wise Owl. When Amir woke, dawn was breaking, and the storm had passed. The world outside the hollow was dripping and fresh, washed clean by the violence of the night before. Everything sparkled with moisture, and the air smelled of salt and earth and new beginnings. He turned to thank the owl again, but Athena was gone for a moment. Amir wondered if he'd dreamed the entire encounter. But no, he was in a hollow he hadn't found himself, high in a tree he'd never climbed, and his body bore the marks of rescue rather than the ravages of drowning. It had been real. Love, the owl had said. A love that sees you truly and chooses you anyway. The words resonated in Amir's heart as he stretched his wings, sore but functional, and emerged from the hollow. Below, the landscape had been transformed by the storm. Trees were down. The marsh had overflowed its bounds, and debris was scattered everywhere. But life was already reasserting itself. Birds called. Animals emerged from hiding. The sun climbed higher. Amir took flight, his wings catching the morning air, and began searching for the flock. He found them several miles inland, gathered at a lake that the storm had somehow left relatively untouched. Many were bedraggled and exhausted, but they were alive. Elder was there too, looking even more weary than before, but his eyes brightened when he saw Amir. That day, Amir hunted with renewed purpose. The storm had disrupted the waters, bringing fish into shallower areas where they were easier to catch. He ate his fill for the first time in a week, feeling strength return to his body. And again, when he had caught extra, he brought some to Elder, who accepted with what looked remarkably like a smile. Over the next few days, as the flock recovered from the storm, Amir found his thoughts constantly returning to Athena's words, "A kingdom by the sea where gardens meet the waves." He had no map, no specific directions, but something in him recognized the rightness of the destination. His instincts, both bird and something deeper, pulled him southward along the coast. The flock was preparing to move on as well, following their ancient migratory routes. But as they gathered to depart, Amir realized with a pang that his path was diverging from theirs. They would head inland, toward traditional wintering grounds. He needed to continue along the coast. On the morning of departure, Amir approached Elder one last time. The old stork regarded him with those knowing eyes, and for a moment, Amir could have sworn the bird understood that this was farewell. Elder extended one wing, brushing it gently against Amir's in a gesture that felt like a blessing. Then the flock took to the air, a great swirling cloud of white wings against the blue sky, and Amir watched them go. He was alone again, but this time it felt different. This time, he was choosing his path rather than simply fleeing. This time, he had hope. He flew south, hugging the coastline, and with each passing day, the landscape changed. The marshes gave way to rocky shores, then to gentler beaches backed by palm trees. The air grew slightly cooler, touched by sea breezes. And finally, after 3 days of steady travel, he saw it. A city rose on a promontory overlooking the sea. white buildings climbing up from the harbor, crowned by a magnificent palace that seemed to float between sea and sky. But what caught Amir's attention were the gardens, extraordinary gardens that cascaded down from the palace in terraced levels, so lush and green they seemed to glow against the white stone and blue water gardens that literally met the waves, just as Athena had described. Amir's heart raced. This was it. This was where his next chapter would unfold. But what did that mean? What would happen here? He circled higher, studying the palace and its surroundings. The gardens were extensive, with fountains and pools, trees and flower beds, and winding paths that invited wandering. He could see people moving through them, servants, guards, and occasionally figures in finer clothing who might be nobility. As the sun began to set, painting the palace in shades of gold and rose, Amir decided to descend to the gardens. He was weary from days of travel, and the pools he'd seen would have fish. More than that, something drew him there, a feeling he couldn't name, a sense that this was exactly where he needed to be. He landed in a secluded corner of the gardens near a fountain surrounded by flowering bushes. The water was clear and cool, and yes, small fish darted through it. He drank deeply, the fresh water a blessing after days of rain and salt spray. As he explored his new surroundings, Amir was struck by the beauty of these gardens. They were different from his home palace gardens, less formal, more natural, as if the gardeners had worked with nature rather than imposing strict order upon it. Jasmine and honeysuckle scented the air. Birds sang from every tree, not just storks or marsh birds, but songbirds of every variety. Butterflies danced over flowers. It was a place of peace and life. Night fell, and Amir found a comfortable roosting spot in an ancient fig tree whose branches hung over one of the larger pools. From here, he could see much of the garden and, through the trees, catch glimpses of the palace itself. Lights appeared in windows. Music drifted down. Someone was playing a stringed instrument, the melody haunting and beautiful. For the first time since his transformation, Amir felt something like contentment, not happiness. He was still trapped in the wrong body, still exiled from his real life, but a sense of being in the right place, of standing on the threshold of something important. He didn't know that in one of those lit windows, a princess sat playing her oud, gazing out at the gardens she loved, feeling restless and trapped despite her privileged life, yearning for something she couldn't name. He didn't know that tomorrow their lives would intersect in a way that would change everything. He only knew that Athena had been right. Everything was about to change. As sleep claimed him, cradled in the fig tree's branches with the sound of the sea in the distance, Prince Amir, the Stork Prince, dreamed of gardens and music, of transformations and hope, of a future that remained hidden but somehow felt closer than it had in months. The storm had passed. The journey had led him here, and now, the most important trial of all was about to begin. Chapter 9. First Meeting with the Princess. Princess Jamila woke before dawn, as was her custom. While the rest of the palace still slept, she loved to walk in the gardens, when the world was quiet and she could think her own thoughts without the constant attention that accompanied her royal status. She was 17, considered by many to be the jewel of her father's kingdom. Intelligent, accomplished, and beautiful, with dark eyes that missed little and a spirit that chafed at the constraints placed upon her. Her father, Sultan Khalid, loved her dearly, but couldn't understand her restlessness. He offered her everything: jewels, clothes, entertainment, education, but none of it satisfied the yearning in her heart. Jamila felt trapped by expectation, by the role she was supposed to play. She was supposed to be content with embroidery and poetry, to smile gracefully while suitors presented themselves, to accept that her future would be determined by politics and alliances rather than her own wishes. But she wanted more, though what more meant she couldn't quite articulate. The gardens were her refuge. Here, among the plants and animals, she felt more herself. She had studied botany and knew the name of every plant. She could identify birds by their songs. She understood the delicate balance of the ecosystem her great-grandfather had created when he built these extraordinary terraced gardens. This morning, she walked her favorite path, which wound through flowering bushes toward the large pool beneath the ancient fig tree. The sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue, and the stars were fading one by one. As she approached the pool, movement caught her eye. A white stork stood in the shallows, fishing in the early morning light. Jamila stopped, not wanting to disturb it. Storks occasionally visited the gardens during migration season, but she'd never seen one quite like this. There was something unusual about this bird. It moved with a strange mixture of grace and awkwardness, as if still learning its own body. And when it successfully caught a fish and swallowed it, the bird seemed almost surprised by its own success. Jamila smiled. She loved watching animals behave naturally, without the artifice that characterized so much of palace life. The stork suddenly sensed her presence and turned, fixing her with eyes that seemed remarkably intelligent. For a long moment, they regarded each other, princess and bird, both awake while the world slept, both somehow out of place in their own lives. "Good morning," Jamila said softly, not expecting a response but unable to remain silent. "Welcome to the gardens. You're safe here." The stork tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that should have been unnerving but somehow wasn't. Then it made a soft sound, not the harsh call storks typically made, but something gentler, almost like a response. Jamila laughed quietly. "You're an unusual one, aren't you?" She moved closer, slowly, and the bird didn't flee. Instead, it watched her approach with what looked like curiosity. She settled on a stone bench near the pool, and to her surprise, the stork waited closer, stopping just a few feet away. It was boldness unusual for a wild bird, but the creature didn't seem threatening or aggressive, just interested. "I come here every morning," Jamila told the bird, falling into the habit she had of talking to the garden animals. "It's the only time I feel truly free. The rest of the day, I'm Princess Jamila, and I have to be proper and suitable and everything a princess should be. But here, I can just be me." The stork made another soft sound, and Jamila could have sworn it was sympathetic. "You probably think I'm foolish," she continued. "What could a princess have to complain about? I have everything: wealth, comfort, safety. But sometimes I feel like a beautiful bird in a golden cage, fed and protected, yes, but not free. Not really." The stork moved closer still, and now Jamila could see it in more detail. Its feathers were pristine white with black flight feathers. Its legs were red, long, and elegant. But it was the eyes that captured her attention, dark and expressive, holding a depth of emotion that seemed almost human. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "You don't act like other birds. It's as if you understand what I'm saying." For Amir, hearing human speech clearly for the first time in months was overwhelming. And not just any speech. This girl was speaking in his own language, the dialect of his homeland, though with a slightly different accent. She was speaking to him, truly speaking to him, as if he were a person rather than just an animal. He desperately wanted to respond, to tell her who he was, to explain everything, but all that emerged was a stork's trill. The frustration of it brought tears to his eyes. Actual tears, visible and real. Jamila saw them, and gasped. "You're crying," she whispered. "I've never seen a bird cry before. Oh, you poor thing, are you hurt? Are you lost?" She reached out slowly, and Amir didn't pull away. Her hand gently touched his feathered head, the first kind human contact he'd had since his transformation. The tenderness of it nearly broke him. "You can stay here," Jamila said softly, "as long as you need. The gardens are a sanctuary. No one will harm you here. I'll make sure of it." It was a promise, and Amir could hear the sincerity in her voice. This princess, this stranger, was offering him protection, safety, kindness, asking nothing in return. She saw a creature in distress and responded with compassion. In that moment, something shifted in Amir's heart. He had met many people in his life as a prince, nobles and dignitaries who treated him with respect because of his title, servants who attended him because it was their duty, tutors who taught him because they were paid to do so. But this girl knew nothing about who he really was. She saw only a bird, and she offered kindness anyway. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding the gardens with golden light, and in that light, Jamila smiled at the stork who had somehow become, in just a few moments, something like a friend. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "The palace will be waking soon and I'm expected at breakfast. But I'll come back this evening. Will you be here?" Amir nodded his bird head emphatically, and Jamila's smile widened. "I think you do understand me. How extraordinary." She stood, but before leaving, she reached into a pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread she'd brought for the garden birds. She broke it into pieces and scattered it near the pool. "In case you're still hungry." Then she walked back up the garden path, glancing back twice to see if the stork was still there. Both times, Amir was watching her go, and both times she waved. After she disappeared into the palace, Amir stood in the morning light, his heart full of strange new feelings. He had come to this garden following a mystical owl's guidance, expecting what? He didn't know. But he hadn't expected this immediate connection with someone who saw him, truly saw him, even though she couldn't know who he really was. Love, Athena had said. A love that sees you truly and chooses you anyway. Was this the beginning of that? Could it be? It seemed impossible. She was a princess, and he was a bird. Even if the curse could be broken, even if he could return to human form, they were from different kingdoms, and there were complexities and politics that would make any relationship difficult. But standing there in the gardens as the sun climbed higher, Amir felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, the owl had been right. Maybe everything was about to change. He spent the day exploring the gardens more thoroughly, familiarizing himself with every path and pool, every tree and flower. He noticed the care with which everything was maintained, the thoughtfulness of the design that created spaces for both people and wildlife. These gardens reflected their creator's values. Beauty, yes, but also kindness and consideration for all living things. Several times he saw servants moving through the gardens, tending plants or cleaning paths. He saw guards patrolling, watchful but not aggressive. And once, in the distance, he glimpsed a man in fine robes who might be the Sultan, walking with advisors, discussing matters of state while moving through this beautiful space. But he didn't see Jamila again until evening, when the sun was setting and the garden was painted in shades of amber and rose. She came alone, carrying a small bag, and her face lit up when she saw him waiting by the pool. "You stayed," she said happily. "I was afraid you might have flown away." Amir hopped toward her, calling softly in greeting, and Jamila laughed. "I brought you something," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out pieces of fish, fresh and substantial, clearly taken from the palace kitchens. "I thought you might prefer this to bread. Storks eat fish, don't they?" She tossed the pieces into the shallow water, and Amir, touched by her thoughtfulness, caught and ate them. They were delicious, seasoned and prepared by skilled cooks, far better than anything he'd caught himself in weeks. Jamila settled on her bench, watching him with evident pleasure. "I asked the palace librarian about storks today," she said. "He told me you're probably migrating, that you'll move on soon to warmer grounds. But I hope you'll stay a while. I've never had such an attentive listener before." And so began a pattern that would repeat over the following days and weeks. Jamila visiting in the early mornings and evenings, bringing food, talking to the unusual stork who seemed to understand her, finding in this strange friendship something she'd been missing without knowing it, and Amir, unable to speak but able to listen, learned about the princess who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. He learned about her dreams of freedom, her love of learning, her frustration with the limited role she was expected to play. He learned about her kindness to servants, her patience with her father's expectations, her secret wish to travel and see the world beyond the palace walls. In the quiet spaces of the garden, between a princess and a prince transformed, a connection was forming, fragile as spring blossoms, unexpected as rain in the desert, but real and growing stronger with each passing day. Neither of them understood yet what it would become. Neither knew that this was exactly what the curse required, a connection built not on titles or appearances, but on something deeper and more true. But in the gardens where the sea met the land and the ordinary world touched magic, the seeds of transformation, the real transformation, the one that mattered most, were being planted. And in time, those seeds would bloom into something that could break even the strongest curse. Chapter 10. Envy and the Trial of the Guards. For 3 weeks, the friendship between Jamila and the stork deepened in the quiet sanctuary of the gardens. Amir had never imagined that communication without words could be so rich. Jamila would talk, and he would respond with movements, gestures, and soft calls that she somehow understood. She brought him food, and he would bring her gifts in return. Beautiful shells from the beach, interesting stones, once even a rare flower he'd found growing wild beyond the garden walls. The palace staff began to notice the princess's attachment to the unusual stork. Some found it charming, speaking fondly of the gentle princess who befriended wild creatures, but others viewed it with suspicion or concern. Chief among these was Rashida, the Sultan's senior advisor, a woman of sharp intelligence and sharper ambition. Rashida had served Sultan Khalid for 20 years, and in that time, she had accumulated considerable power. She had no children of her own, but she had a nephew, Hassan, whom she'd been positioning as a potential match for Princess Jamila. Hassan was handsome and charming when he wanted to be, educated and sophisticated, but beneath the polished surface lay a character as flawed as Rashida's, vain, entitled, and convinced that Princess Jamila should be his by right. Together, aunt and nephew had been working to arrange a marriage that would cement their position in the kingdom. But Jamila had shown no interest in Hassan, politely declining his invitations, remaining distant during his visits. And lately, she seemed even more distracted, spending hours in the gardens with that peculiar bird. "It's unnatural," Rashida said to Hassan as they walked through the palace corridors. "A princess of her station, spending so much time with an animal people are beginning to talk." Hassan's handsome face twisted into something ugly. "She refuses my company but accepts a bird's? It's insulting." "More than that," Rashida said thoughtfully, "it's suspicious I've watched them together. The bird behaves strangely, too intelligently. and I've seen the way Jamila looks at it, as if she sees something more than just an animal." "What are you suggesting?" Hassan asked. "I'm suggesting that perhaps this is no ordinary bird," Rashida replied. "There are old stories of transformation magic, of curses and enchantments. What if someone is using this creature to influence the princess, to interfere with our plans?" It was paranoia born of ambition, but not entirely without foundation. Rashida had lived long enough to know that magic, while rare, was real, and this situation felt wrong in ways she couldn't quite articulate. "We should get rid of it," Hassan said bluntly. "Kill it and be done with the problem." "No," Rashida said quickly. "If we harm a creature the princess cares for, we'll only drive her further from you. But we can test our suspicions. If this is truly just a bird, it will behave like a bird when threatened. If it's something more—" She left the thought unfinished, but Hassan understood. That evening, they set their plan in motion. Amir was resting in his usual spot beneath the fig tree, waiting for Jamila's evening visit, when he sensed danger. 4 palace guards approached from different directions, moving with obvious purpose toward him. Their hands were on their weapons, and their expressions were cold. Amir's heart raced. What was happening? Had he done something wrong? Were birds not allowed in these gardens after all? He stood, ready to fly if necessary, but the guards moved quickly, surrounding him, cutting off escape routes. One of them carried a net. "Carefully," the lead guard said. "We're to capture it unharmed if possible, but it's not to escape." Capture him? Why? Panic flooded through Amir as the guards closed in. He spread his wings, crying out in alarm, but the net swept toward him. He tried to dodge, to take flight, but the net was large and the guards were skilled. It caught him, tangling his wings, pulling him down. He fought desperately, thrashing against the mesh, calling out in distress. The guards held the net firmly, keeping him contained despite his struggles. "It fights harder than a normal bird would," one guard observed. "Stronger, too." "Just secure it," the leader ordered. "We'll take it to the eastern courtyard as instructed." They were carrying him away, and Amir's mind raced with terror and confusion. Where were they taking him? What would they do to him? And where was Jamila? She would stop this if she knew she had promised he would be safe here. As if his thoughts had summoned her, Jamila's voice rang out across the garden. "Stop! What are you doing?" The guards halted, and through the mesh of the net, Amir could see Jamila running down the path, her face flushed with anger and alarm. She was still dressed in her court clothes, having clearly just left some palace function to come to their usual meeting spot. "Your Highness," the lead guard said respectfully but firmly, "we have orders from the Sultan's advisor to remove this bird from the gardens. It's been deemed a potential threat." "A threat?" Jamila's voice rose with indignation. "That's absurd. This bird has been here for weeks, and it's never threatened anyone who gave this order." "Advisor Rashida, Your Highness. She expressed concern for your safety." "My safety?" Jamila looked at the struggling stork in the net, saw the terror in its eyes, and her expression hardened with determination. "Release that bird immediately. That's an order." The guards exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Your Highness, we have our orders from—" "I am a princess of this kingdom," Jamila said, her voice carrying an authority Amir had never heard from her before. "You will release that bird now, or you will answer to my father for disobeying a direct command from his daughter." The tension stretched taut for a long moment. The guards were caught between conflicting authorities. Rashida, who controlled much of the palace's daily operations, and the princess, who technically outranked even senior advisors. Finally, the lead guard made his decision. He nodded to his men, and they opened the net, freeing Amir. He stumbled out, His wings tangled and his dignity shattered, and immediately moved toward Jamila, seeking the protection she represented. Jamila knelt, checking him for injuries, her hands gentle but her expression still fierce. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" Amir shook his head, a distinctly non-bird gesture that didn't escape the guard's notice, and pressed closer to Jamila, his heart still racing. "This isn't over, Your Highness," the lead guard said quietly. "Advisor Rashida will take this matter to the Sultan." "Then I will speak to my father as well," Jamila said, standing. "I will tell him that his guards attacked a harmless creature that was under my protection. We'll see what he has to say about that." The guards withdrew, and Jamila waited until they were out of sight before her stern facade crumbled. She sank onto her bench, pulling the stork gently into her arms, and Amir felt her trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have known. I should have protected you better. Rashida has been watching us. I've seen her, though I didn't realize what it meant. She wants me to marry her nephew, and she sees you as— I don't know what she sees you as— a distraction, a threat to her plans." She stroked his feathers gently, and Amir felt the rapid beating of her heart against his body. She had risked political consequences to protect him. She had challenged guards and defied a powerful advisor, all for a bird she'd known for only a few weeks. Why, he wondered, why would she take such risks for me? But even as he asked the question, he understood the answer. It was the same reason he'd given fish to Elder when he was starving, the same reason Jamila talked to him as an equal rather than a pet. Some people, when they saw another being in need, responded with compassion rather than calculation. It was character, not strategy. And in that moment, Amir felt something shift in his heart. What had begun as gratitude and friendship was becoming something deeper, something that made his pulse race and his thoughts scatter, something he'd never experienced before because he'd never had the chance. Princes being sheltered from romance until arrangements could be properly made. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have been impossible. He was a bird. She was a princess. Everything about the situation was absurd, but Athena's words echoed in his mind. A love that sees you truly and chooses you anyway. Jamila saw him, not as Prince Amir of a distant kingdom, not as a political alliance or a convenient match. She saw the being he was right now, vulnerable and voiceless, trapped in the wrong form, and she chose to protect him, to befriend him, to care about him anyway. Was this what the curse needed to break? This connection, this caring, this willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the soul beneath? "I won't let them hurt you," Jamila said, her voice strengthening with resolve. "I'll talk to my father tonight. I'll make him understand that you're special, that you need to be protected. You're not just a bird. I know you're not. I can see it in your eyes. There's a person in there, isn't there? Someone trapped, someone lost." Amir's breath caught. She knew. She didn't understand the specifics, couldn't possibly guess the truth, but she knew he was more than he appeared. She saw him. He lifted his head and gently touched his beak to her cheek, a bird's kiss, inadequate to express what he felt but all he could offer. Jamila laughed through the tears he hadn't realized she was crying. "I must seem so foolish to you, a princess weeping over a bird. But you're not just a bird. You're my friend. Perhaps the truest friend I've ever had, because you listen without judging, you accept me without trying to change me, and you stay even though you could fly away at any time. If only you knew," Amir thought, "that I stay because I couldn't leave even if I wanted to, that these weeks with you have been the first time since my transformation that I felt truly seen, that you've given me something I didn't even know I was missing." They sat together as the sun set, the princess and the stork, each offering the other a kind of salvation neither could name but both desperately needed. The gardens darkened around them, and stars began to appear in the deepening sky. The same stars that had watched over Amir's transformation, that had witnessed his journey, that now looked down on this impossible friendship that was becoming something more. The trial of the guards had been passed, but both Jamila and Amir sensed that greater challenges lay ahead. Forces in the palace opposed their friendship, and those forces would not give up easily. But for tonight, in the sanctuary of the gardens, they had each other, and that, for now, was enough. Chapter 11. Friendship and Secret Walks. True to her word, Princess Jamila spoke to her father that very night. Sultan Khalid listened to his daughter's passionate defense of the unusual stork, watched the fire in her eyes as she described the guard's attack, and saw something he'd been missing. His daughter truly cared about this creature, in a way she rarely cared about anything these days. Rashida says the bird is dangerous, the Sultan said carefully, that it behaves unnaturally, that it might be enchanted. And if it is? Jamila challenged. If this is a creature under some spell, doesn't that make it more deserving of protection, not less? Would we turn away someone cursed through no fault of their own? Sultan Khalid smiled slightly. His daughter had inherited his sense of justice, it seemed. You make a fair point. Very well, I will declare the bird under your official protection, Rashida, and her guards will not interfere with it again. But Jamila, he grew serious. Be careful. If there is magic involved, there may be dangers you don't understand. I'll be careful, father, Jamila promised, though they both knew she wouldn't let caution override her compassion. With the Sultan's decree, Amir's position in the gardens became secure. The guards who had tried to capture him now nodded respectfully when they passed. Servants began leaving small dishes of fish near the pools. Even Rashida, though her eyes remained cold and calculating whenever she saw the stork, made no further moves against him. The days that followed were the happiest Amir had known since his transformation. Each morning and evening, Jamila would come to the gardens, and they would spend hours together. She continued to talk to him, sharing her thoughts and feelings, but now their time together included something more: exploration. Jamila began taking walks through parts of the garden Amir hadn't yet explored, and he would fly alongside her, or walk beside her on his long legs, a strange pair that somehow fit together perfectly. She showed him her favorite spots, a hidden grotto where ferns grew thick and water dripped musically from stones, a viewpoint from which they could see the entire coastline, an ancient olive tree that her great-grandfather had planted when the gardens were first created. This tree is over 100 years old, Jamila said, touching its gnarled trunk with reverence. It's seen generations of my family. Sometimes I think about all the changes it's witnessed, the palace being built, the gardens growing, children becoming adults, and adults growing old. We humans think our problems are so important, but trees like this remind us that we're just small moments in a much larger story. Amir looked up at the sprawling branches, considered the perspective Jamila offered, and felt something shift in his understanding. His transformation, as devastating as it had been personally, was indeed just one moment in a vast tapestry of existence. The curse had made him feel like his identity had been stolen, but perhaps identity was more fluid than he'd believed. Perhaps he was still himself, just evolving. The walks became ritual, times when both Jamila and Amir could escape the weight of their respective roles. For her, it was freedom from endless protocol and expectation. For him, it was a chance to feel almost human again, to be treated as a companion rather than an animal. During these walks, Amir noticed details about the gardens he'd missed before Jamila knew every plant, every tree, every hidden corner. She would point out birds' nests and identify the species. She showed him which flowers attracted which butterflies. She explained the engineering of the irrigation system that kept everything thriving. "My great-grandfather designed all of this," she said one evening, as they stood beside a clever fountain that used gravity to create multiple cascading levels. He believed that a ruler's first duty was to create beauty and harmony, not just in government, but in the physical world. He said that people who lived surrounded by beauty would develop beautiful souls. "Do you believe that?" Amir wished he could ask. As if reading his thought, Jamila considered the question. "I think beauty helps," she said slowly. "But I think kindness matters more. You can have the most beautiful palace in the world, but if the people in it are cruel, it becomes a pretty prison. What makes these gardens special isn't just how they look, it's that they're a sanctuary for all living things. Nothing here is harmed or hunted, even the weeds have their place." She glanced at Amir with a smile. "That's why you're safe here. That's why I'll always protect you. Everyone deserves a sanctuary." During one of their walks, they encountered a crisis that would further cement their bond. A young peacock, one of several that roamed the gardens as living ornaments, had become tangled in some discarded netting near the beach garden. It was thrashing in panic, making the entanglement worse, and its cries of distress echoed through the evening air. Jamila rushed to help, but the peacock was too frightened to distinguish friend from threat. Every time Jamila got close, it lashed out with its sharp beak and claws, making rescue impossible. Amir watched for a moment, then made a decision. He approached from the opposite side, calling softly in the bird language he'd learned during his months as a stork. The peacock, hearing one of its own kind, turned its attention to Amir. He continued making calming sounds, moving slowly closer, using his beak to indicate the net. The peacock gradually calmed, its bird instincts recognizing that this stork meant no harm. While Amir kept it distracted and soothed, Jamila was able to approach from behind and carefully cut away the netting. Within minutes, the peacock was free, ruffling its feathers indignantly before stalking away with as much dignity as it could muster. Jamila stared at Amir with wonder. "You saved it," she said. "You understood what it needed, and you communicated with it somehow. How is that possible if you're just—" She stopped, shaking her head. "You're not just anything, are you? There's so much more to you than anyone realizes." She knelt so they were at eye level, and Amir saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I wish you could tell me your story," she whispered. "I wish you could tell me who you really are, what happened to you. Because something did happen, didn't it? You weren't always a bird." Amir's heart ached with the desperate desire to speak, to tell her everything. But all he could do was touch his beak gently to her hand in acknowledgement. Jamila wiped her eyes and stood, managing a smile. "Well, whatever your story is, I'm glad you found your way to these gardens. I'm glad I found you, or you found me. However it happened." As they walked back toward the palace in the gathering dusk, Jamila began to talk about something she'd never mentioned before, her own frustrations with her life. "Everyone thinks being a princess is wonderful," she said, "and in many ways it is. I'm privileged beyond measure, but sometimes I feel like I'm just an ornament, like those peacocks, beautiful to look at, useful for impressing visitors, but not really real. Not really a person with my own thoughts and dreams that matter." She paused by a fountain, trailing her fingers in the water. "Rashida keeps pushing her nephew at me. Hassan is handsome and educated and perfectly suitable, and I know my father would approve the match because it would secure Rashida's loyalty. But Hassan looks at me the way someone might look at a prize horse, appreciating the value but not seeing the individual. When he talks to me, he's talking to Princess Jamila, the role I play, not to me." She looked at Amir, and her expression was vulnerable in a way he'd never seen. "But you see me. I don't know how, but you do. When I talk to you, I feel heard. When I'm with you, I feel like I can be myself. Not the princess, not the daughter, not the potential bride. Just Jamila." The sunset painted her face in shades of gold and rose, and Amir thought he'd never seen anyone more beautiful, not because of her physical appearance, though she was lovely, but because of the soul that shone through, the kindness, the intelligence, the courage to question the life she'd been given and search for something more authentic. "I love you," he thought, the realization settling over him with certainty. "Not just as a friend, not just as someone who's been kind to me. I love you. The real you, the person you are when no one else is watching." But he couldn't tell her. He could only walk beside her as the stars began to appear, their light reflecting in the fountains and pools, turning the gardens into something magical. "Tomorrow," Jamila said as they reached the point where she had to return to the palace, "I'll bring paper and ink. Maybe we can find a way for you to communicate more clearly. If you can understand me, maybe you can learn to write or draw or something. There has to be a way." Hope flared in Amir's chest. Could it work? Could he learn to use his beak to write words, to finally tell her who he was? But even as hope rose, doubt followed. What if telling her the truth changed everything? What if knowing he was a cursed prince made her treat him differently? Right now, she cared for him as he was, vulnerable, powerless, just a bird who needed friendship. Would she still see him the same way if she knew about his royal birth, his privileged past, his human form, and more troubling still, if he was meant to learn something from this curse, would breaking the secret undo the lesson? Was keeping his identity hidden part of the trial? These questions swirled in Amir's mind as he watched Jamila walk back to the palace, her figure gradually disappearing into the shadows. The garden settled into night around him, full of familiar sounds and scents, but his thoughts were turbulent. Athena had said that love was the key, a love that saw him truly and chose him anyway. Jamila saw him, or at least she saw enough to recognize he was more than he appeared. She had chosen to protect him, to befriend him, to spend her precious free time with him, despite the political complications it created. Was that enough? Or did the curse require something more? Amir flew to his roosting spot in the fig tree, settling among the leaves as the moon rose over the sea. Below, the garden spread out in silver and shadow, beautiful and mysterious. Somewhere in the palace, Jamila was probably getting ready for bed, maybe thinking about him, maybe planning how she would help him communicate tomorrow. The thought warmed him, even as uncertainty troubled him. They were crossing some invisible threshold, he sensed. The friendship that had sustained them both was becoming something deeper, something that would either break the curse or bind him more tightly to his feathered form. All he could do was trust the process, trust Jamila, trust that the trials he'd endured had prepared him for whatever came next. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and possibly new revelations. But tonight, under the watchful stars, Amir allowed himself to simply feel grateful for the gift he'd been given, the friendship of someone who saw past surfaces to the soul beneath, who offered kindness without calculation, who made even a curse bearable through the simple power of caring. The gardens whispered around him, full of life and secrets, and somewhere in that whispering, Amir thought he heard Athena's voice again. Trust the journey. Remain yourself. Love will show the way. He closed his eyes and let sleep claim him, cradled by leaves and moonlight, dreaming of a tomorrow where perhaps, finally, he might find his voice again. Chapter 12. The Trial of Loyalty. Jamila kept her promise. The next evening, she arrived at the gardens carrying a leather satchel containing paper, ink, and various writing instruments adapted for different purposes. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she spread everything out on her favorite bench. "I've been thinking about this all day," she said. "If you can understand language, maybe you can produce it too. Somehow we just need to find the right method." She showed him the various options she'd brought. Brushes of different sizes, sticks of charcoal, even a stylus for pressing marks into wax tablets. Amir examined each one, trying to imagine how his beak might manage them. They spent the next hour experimenting. The brushes were too soft for him to grip properly. The charcoal broke when he tried to apply enough pressure, but the stylus, held carefully in his beak, could make impressions in the wax. Laboriously, painstakingly, Amir pressed marks into the wax tablet. His first attempts were illegible scratches. Bird anatomy simply wasn't designed for writing, but gradually, with Jamila's patient encouragement, he managed to form something resembling a letter. Then another. "You're doing it," Jamila breathed, watching with amazement. "You really can write. I knew it. I knew you weren't just a bird." It took nearly half an hour of intense concentration for Amir to scratch out 2 words. "Thank you." Jamila's eyes filled with tears when she read them. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, you're welcome, for everything, for being my friend." She reached out and gently stroked his feathered head. "This must be so frustrating for you, having so much to say but being trapped without a voice. I can't imagine." She stopped suddenly, her expression changing. "Actually, maybe I can imagine, a little, not being able to speak your truth, being trapped in a form that isn't really you. Maybe that's not so different from what I experience. Trapped in the role of princess when I want to be something more." Amir looked up at her, struck by the parallel. Yes, he wanted to communicate. She was right. Being trapped without a voice, unable to express his true self, was the most frustrating part of the curse, and she understood, because in her own way, she experienced something similar. Over the following days, they continued these communication sessions. Amir slowly gained proficiency with the stylus, though writing remained exhausting and time-consuming. He managed to scratch out simple messages: yes, no, friend, safe, happy. Each word was a victory, a small bridge across the gulf that separated them. But he still hadn't revealed his true identity. Every time he considered scratching out, "I am prince" or "I am cursed," something held him back. Fear, perhaps, that the revelation would change everything. Or maybe intuition that the time wasn't yet right. Their routine had settled into comfortable patterns: morning walks, evening communication sessions, quiet times just sitting together as the sun set or rose. Other palace residents had grown accustomed to seeing the princess with her unusual companion. Some found it charming, others puzzling. But with the sultan's decree protecting Amir, no one dared interfere. Except Rashida. The senior advisor had not given up her ambitions for her nephew Hassan. She watched the growing bond between Jamila and the stork with increasing concern and a growing certainty that this was no ordinary bird. Her suspicions deepened into determination to expose whatever enchantment was at work. "I've consulted old texts," she told Hassan during one of their private meetings. "There are legends of transformation curses, powerful magic that can trap someone in animal form. The conditions for breaking such curses vary, but many require a specific trigger. Often, it's love. Love? Hassan sneered. Between a princess and a bird? That's ridiculous. Is it? Rashida's eyes were calculating. I've watched them. The way she looks at that creature. The way it responds to her. There's a connection there that goes beyond girl and pet. What if someone has been cursed into bird form? What if they're hoping the princess's affection will break the spell and transform them back into a human who might then have a claim on her hand? Hassan's expression darkened. If that's true, we need to stop it. Jamila is meant to be mine. I've waited for years, and I'm not going to lose her to some enchanted beggar who's tricked her with magic. We can't simply kill the creature. That would turn Jamila against us completely, Rashida said. But we can test it, force it into a situation where its true nature is revealed. If it really is a cursed human, we can expose the deception. If it's just a bird, well, then we'll know Jamila's attachment is merely a foolish fancy that will pass. They began to plot, drawing on Rashida's knowledge of old magic and Hassan's willingness to use whatever means necessary to achieve his goals. The trap was sprung 3 days later. Jamila arrived for her usual evening visit to find the gardens unusually empty of servants and guards. Amir was waiting in their customary spot, and she greeted him with her usual warm smile, carrying the wax tablet they'd been using for communication. But as she set down the tablet and began to speak, figures emerged from the surrounding bushes. Hassan and 6 guards moving to surround them. Jamila jumped up, startled and immediately angry. Hassan, what is the meaning of this? I'm saving you from yourself, Hassan said, his handsome face set in stubborn lines. This creature has enchanted you, Jamila. You spend all your time with it. You neglect your duties. You refuse suitable matches. It's not natural. The only thing unnatural here is you ambushing me in my own gardens, Jamila retorted. Leave, now. You have no authority to— Actually, Rashida said, emerging from the shadows. We do. I've spoken with your father, expressed concerns about potential magical interference. He's given permission to test the creature. Test it how? Jamila's voice rose with alarm. Rashida nodded to the guards, and they moved toward Amir with a large iron cage. If it's just a bird, it will behave like a bird. If it's something more, we'll see the truth soon enough. Amir backed away, his heart pounding. This was like the first attack, but worse, more calculated, more dangerous. He looked to Jamila, saw the fear and fury in her eyes, and knew she would try to protect him. But what could she do against 6 armed guards and the Sultan's advisor acting with his permission? Don't hurt him, Jamila cried out, moving between Amir and the guards. Please, Rashida, whatever you think he is, there's no need for violence. He's never harmed anyone. Then he won't be harmed, Rashida said smoothly. We simply want to keep him contained while we conduct certain tests. The guards moved in, and Jamila tried to block them, but Hassan grabbed her arms, holding her back. Don't interfere, Jamila. This is for your own good. Let me go. She struggled against his grip, her fury evident. Hassan, if you ever want even a chance with me, you'll release me right now. But Hassan held firm, and the guards descended on Amir. He tried to fly, but they were prepared this time. A net swept out, catching his wings before he could gain altitude. Within seconds, he was trapped in the iron cage, its bars too close together for him to squeeze through. Jamila wrenched herself free from Hassan and ran to the cage, dropping to her knees beside it. I'm sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I'll fix this. I promise I'll fix this. Amir pressed against the bars closest to her, his heart breaking at her distress. Through the bars, their eyes met, and in hers, he saw not just sadness, but a fierce determination that gave him hope. "Take it to the Eastern Tower," Rashida commanded. "Post guards. No one is to approach without my permission." "You can't do this," Jamila protested, standing. "My father gave you permission to test him, not imprison him. I'll go to the Sultan right now." "Your father is in meetings with ambassadors from 3 kingdoms," Rashida said. "He won't be available until tomorrow. By then, we'll know the truth about your pet." As the guards lifted the cage and began carrying Amir away, he and Jamila locked eyes one more time. In that look, promises were made without words. She would fight for him. He would survive this. Their bond, whatever it was, would endure. But as he was carried through the gardens toward the palace's eastern wing, a part he'd never seen before, Amir felt the old fear returning. The cage was small and confining. The tower was isolated. Whatever tests Rashida planned might reveal his true nature, but they might also hurt or even kill him in the process. The Eastern Tower proved to be exactly as forbidding as it sounded. A tall, narrow structure on the oldest part of the palace, rarely used and slightly crumbling. The room where they placed his cage had one small window that looked out over the cliffs and sea. 2 guards were posted at the door. Alone in the darkening room, Amir huddled in his too small cage and tried to think Rashida suspected the truth about him, or something close to it. She was right that he wasn't just a bird, but she was wrong about his motivations. He hadn't sought out Jamila as part of some calculated plan to win a bride. He'd simply followed Athena's guidance and found, unexpectedly, someone who made him feel human again. But how could he prove that? How could he demonstrate that his friendship with Jamila was genuine, not manipulative magic? As night fell and the guards changed shift, Amir heard sounds from below, raised voices, one of them clearly Jamila's. She was arguing with someone, demanding to see him, being refused. The sound of her distress was almost worse than his own captivity. Hours passed. The moon rose, visible through his small window. The sea crashed against the cliffs below, and the wind whistled through cracks in the tower's old stones. Amir was cold, cramped, and more frightened than he'd been since the first days after his transformation. But beneath the fear was something else. Determination. He had survived exile, starvation, storms, and countless trials. He had learned to adapt, to find strength in vulnerability, to offer kindness even when he had nothing else to give. Whatever tests Rashida had planned, he would face them. Not for his own sake, though breaking the curse certainly mattered, but for Jamila's. She had risked political consequences to protect him. She had defied her father's advisor and rejected Hassan's advances. She had believed in him when everyone else saw just a bird. Now it was his turn to prove himself worthy of that faith. In the darkness of the tower, Amir made a silent vow. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever tests he faced, he would not give up. He would not let Rashida's schemes destroy what he and Jamila had built, and he would find a way to reveal the truth, not just about his curse, but about the genuine connection they shared. The night stretched on, cold and lonely, but Amir kept his vigil, watching the moon track across the sky, waiting for dawn and whatever trials it would bring. And in another part of the palace, Jamila sat at her window looking toward the Eastern Tower, making plans of her own. She had been patient, had played by the rules, had accepted limitations that chafed, but not anymore. Not when someone she cared about was threatened. Tomorrow, she would demand answers from her father. She would confront Rashida directly, and if necessary, she would remind everyone in the palace that she was not merely an ornamental princess, but someone with power and will of her own. The gardens lay quiet between them, their usual sanctuary now a contested space. but the connection that had grown there over weeks of shared mornings and evenings, of conversations and silences, of understanding that transcended words, the connection remained unbroken, stretching like an invisible thread between the tower and the palace, between the caged stork and the determined princess. Both waited for dawn, both preparing for the confrontation to come, neither knowing yet how profoundly the next day would change everything. Chapter 13. The Secret Revealed. Dawn broke gray and cold over the palace, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Jamila had barely slept, pacing her chambers, planning arguments, discarding approaches that seemed too weak or too confrontational. She knew she had one chance to save Amir, and she couldn't afford to fail. She dressed carefully in her most formal court attire, deep blue silk embroidered with silver, the colors of her family's house. If she was going to challenge Rashida's authority, she needed to look every inch the princess she was. She arranged her hair in an elaborate style that emphasized her status and wore the sapphire circlet that marked her rank. As soon as the palace began to wake, Jamila made her way to her father's chambers. The ambassadors had departed late last night, and the Sultan would be available now. She found him at breakfast, looking tired but content after successful negotiations. "Jamila," he greeted her warmly, "join me. I have good news about the trade agreements." "Father, we need to talk about the stork," Jamila interrupted, her tone making clear this was urgent. Sultan Khalid sighed. "Rashida spoke to me yesterday. She's concerned that you've developed an unhealthy attachment, that perhaps the creature is enchanted." "And did she mention that she had it imprisoned without consulting me? That she violated your decree protecting it?" The Sultan frowned. "She said it was a temporary measure just to ensure there was no dangerous magic involved." "There's no dangerous magic," Jamila said firmly. "Father, I need you to trust me. This bird, yes, it's unusual. Yes, it's intelligent beyond what we normally see in animals. But it's not dangerous, and it's not trying to harm anyone. If anything, I think it's a victim, not a threat." "A victim of what?" Jamila took a deep breath. "I think it's cursed. I think there's a person trapped inside that bird form, someone who's suffering, someone who needs help rather than imprisonment." Sultan Khalid studied his daughter carefully. He saw the conviction in her eyes, the maturity in her bearing. This wasn't a child's fancy. This was a young woman who had given this matter serious thought and reached a considered conclusion. "And what makes you think this?" he asked. "The bird can write, Father. It holds a stylus in its beak and scratches words into wax tablets. It understands everything I say. It responds to questions, shows emotion, demonstrates reasoning. Birds can't do that, but a human trapped in a bird's body could." The Sultan was quiet for a long moment. "If what you say is true, that makes the situation more complicated, not less. Who is this person? How did they come to be cursed? What do they want?" "I don't know," Jamila admitted. "They haven't told me their full story yet. But Father, does it matter? If someone is suffering under a curse, don't we have an obligation to help them, regardless of who they are or how they came to be in this situation?" "We have an obligation to protect our kingdom first," the Sultan said gently. "If this is a cursed human, they might be dangerous. The curse itself might be dangerous. Rashida isn't wrong to be cautious." "But she is wrong to be cruel," Jamila countered. "The bird has been here for weeks, Father. If it meant harm, wouldn't something have happened by now? All it's done is be my friend." Something in her voice when she said, "friend," made the Sultan look at her more closely. "Jamila, this is just friendship, isn't it?" Jamila felt heat rise to her cheeks. What do you mean? I mean that you're defending this creature with a passion I haven't seen in you before. You reject every suitor who calls on you, but you spend hours each day with a bird, your mother would say. He paused, grief crossing his face as it always did when he mentioned his late wife. She would say that you care more deeply than you're admitting. Does it matter how deeply I care? Jamila asked, her voice trembling slightly. Caring about someone, something, doesn't make my judgment less valid. No, the Sultan agreed, but it might make you less objective about potential dangers. Before Jamila could respond, there was a knock at the door. Rashida entered without waiting for permission, her face set in grim lines. Your Majesty, Princess, you should come to the Eastern Tower. The bird has been exhibiting unusual behavior. I think you both need to see this. The three of them made their way through the palace to the Eastern Tower. As they climbed the stairs, Jamila's heart pounded with worry. What had they done to Amir? Was he hurt? Had he revealed too much in his desperation? The guards opened the door to the tower room, and Jamila rushed inside, her father and Rashida following more slowly. Amir was still in the cage, but the entire room had been transformed. On every available surface, the floor, the walls, even somehow on parts of the ceiling, words were scratched. The stone floor showed marks made with small pebbles. The dusty walls bore traces drawn with a feather dipped in water. Every surface told a story. My name is Amir. The largest message read, scratched laboriously into the stone floor near the cage. Prince of the Northern Kingdom. Cursed by sorcerer Malachi, not dangerous. Need help. Around this central message were other words, fragments of his story, expressions of his desperation, pleas for understanding. Miss my parents been cursed for months. Jamila is kind. Please don't hurt her. Just want to be human again. Jamila's hand flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Amir, she whispered. A prince. He was a prince like her, trapped, suffering, so far from home. Sultan Khalid stared at the messages, his expression unreadable. Rashida looked troubled, her certainty shaken by this revelation. The Northern Kingdom, the Sultan said slowly. That's Sultan Rashid's realm. He sent word months ago that his son had vanished mysteriously. Search parties found no trace. He looked at the stork in the cage with new understanding. You're the missing prince, the one they've been searching for. Amir pressed against the bars, calling out, a sound of confirmation, of relief that finally, someone understood. This changes everything, Rashida said, but her tone was no longer hostile. If this is truly a prince under a curse, we can't simply release him. This is a matter of international importance. We need to help him, Jamila interrupted firmly. She moved to the cage, kneeling beside it. Through the bars, she reached out to touch Amir gently. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you've suffered alone for so long. I'm sorry I didn't realize earlier who you were. No, Amir wanted to say. You treated me exactly right. You saw me, not my title. You cared about me as I am, not who I used to be. That's what made it real. But all he could do was press closer to her touch, conveying what he couldn't say through the contact. Open the cage, Jamila ordered the guards. Jamila, wait, Rashida started. Open it, Sultan Khalid said quietly. The boy has been imprisoned enough if he's truly Prince Amir. He's an honored guest in our kingdom, not a prisoner. The guards opened the cage and Amir stumbled out, his muscles cramped from the long night in the confined space. He stretched his wings, shook his feathers, and then turned to Jamila deliberately. He bowed, a distinctly human gesture of gratitude and respect. So the question now, Sultan Khalid said, is how do we break this curse? I've been researching transformation curses, Rashida admitted. Most require a specific condition to break. Often it involves true love, a kiss, a declaration, a willing sacrifice. But the exact requirement varies depending on how the curse was cast. How do we find out what this curse requires? Jamila asked. As if in answer, the air in the room suddenly shimmered. A soft hooting sound filled the space, and a large owl materialized on the window ledge. The same owl who had saved Amir from the storm, whose presence seemed to bend the normal rules of reality. Athena, Amir called out in recognition. The owl's luminous eyes surveyed everyone in the room. When she spoke, her voice seemed to resonate in their minds rather than their ears. The curse is nearly broken, Athena said. Prince Amir has passed almost all the required trials. He has learned humility by losing his privilege. He has learned compassion by experiencing vulnerability. He has learned the value of genuine connection over superficial advantage. Only one trial remains. What trial? Jamila asked urgently. The trial of true love, Athena replied. Not the comfortable love of family or the convenient love of political alliance, but the rare love that sees completely, past appearances, past status, past everything superficial, and chooses the person beneath a love that accepts without conditions. The owl's gaze fixed on Jamila. Princess, you have befriended this stork without knowing who he truly was. You protected him, talked to him, cared for him as a bird, but now you know he's a prince. The question is, do you love who he is or merely what he is? Jamila felt every eye in the room turn to her. This should have been a private moment, but here she stood with her father, Rashida, guards, an audience for the most important question she'd ever faced. She looked at Amir, really looked at him. Not at a prince or a bird, but at the being she'd come to know over weeks of conversations and quiet companionship. She thought about the gentleness with which he'd calmed the tangled peacock, the way he'd listened to her frustrations without judgment, the small gifts he'd brought her, shells and stones offered with such sincerity, the tears in his eyes when she'd protected him from the guards. She thought about how he'd never tried to impress her or manipulate her, how he'd accepted being voiceless, powerless, dependent on her kindness, how he could have revealed his princely status at any time to gain advantage, but hadn't, letting her come to know him as he truly was rather than as his title. I don't love him because he's a prince, Jamila said quietly. I loved him before I knew that. I loved him when I thought he was just a cursed bird with nowhere else to go. I love him for his kindness, his courage, his patient spirit. I love him for seeing me as I truly am, not as a princess or a political prize, but as Jamila. She moved closer to the stork, kneeling so they were at eye level. I love you, she said clearly, however you are, whatever form you take. I love who you are inside. And you, Prince Amir? Athena asked, though somehow everyone understood the question, even though the owl spoke in ways beyond normal language. Do you love her, truly love her as she is, without calculation or strategy? Amir pressed his feathered head against Jamila's hand, and in that gesture was every answer he couldn't speak. Yes. Yes, he loved her. He loved her courage and compassion. He loved her intelligence and her kindness to all living things. He loved the way she questioned the world rather than accepting it blindly. He loved her not because she was a princess or because loving her might break his curse, but because she was Jamila, unique, irreplaceable, precious. If the curse never broke, if he remained a stork forever, he would still love her. That was the truth he'd discovered in the tower during his long night of captivity. He didn't love her to save himself. He loved her because she had touched his soul in ways that transcended bodies and forms. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Jamila leaned forward and gently kissed the top of the stork's feathered head. The transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. Light burst from Amir's form, not harsh but radiant, warm as sunlight through stained glass. His body began to change, feathers dissolving into light, form shifting and growing. Within seconds, where a stork had stood, a young man knelt. He was perhaps 16, with dark hair and darker eyes, slender but strong, wearing simple clothes that had somehow manifested with his transformation. His face bore traces of the hardship he'd endured, but also a depth of character that months of trials had forged. For a moment, neither Amir nor Jamila moved. Then, slowly, he stood, and she stood with him. They stared at each other, really seeing each other in human form for the first time, yet recognizing the souls they'd already come to know. "Jamila," Amir said, his voice rough from months of disuse but infinitely grateful to finally speak her name aloud. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me, for accepting me, for loving me even when I couldn't be who I used to be." Tears streamed down Jamila's face as she smiled. "Welcome back," she whispered. "Welcome back to yourself." Athena hooted softly from her perch, satisfaction evident in the sound. "The curse is broken. The trials are complete. Love has proven stronger than magic, as it always must when it's true." She spread her magnificent wings. "My work here is done. Live well, both of you. You've earned your happiness." And with that, the owl vanished as mysteriously as she'd appeared, leaving behind only a single white feather that drifted slowly to the floor. Sultan Khalid cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the more practical matters at hand. "Well," he said, a smile playing at his lips, "this is certainly unprecedented. Prince Amir of the Northern Kingdom, you're welcome in our realm, and it seems my daughter has made her choice regarding suitors, though not in any manner I anticipated." Rashida, to her credit, bowed deeply to Amir. "Your Highness, I apologize for your imprisonment. I acted out of caution, but I see now that I misjudged the situation." Amir, still adjusting to having a human voice again, replied with grace that surprised even himself. "You sought to protect your kingdom and your princess. That's admirable. Even if the execution was flawed, I understand caution. These past months have taught me that appearances can deceive and that trust must be earned, not demanded." He turned to Jamila, and his voice softened. "But you gave me trust before I earned it. You gave me friendship when I had nothing to offer in return. That's a gift I'll treasure all my life." "You had plenty to offer," Jamila said, taking his hand, his human hand, and marveling at the simple miracle of being able to hold it. "You offered understanding, companionship, acceptance. You listened to my dreams without dismissing them. You saw me as more than just a princess in a palace that's worth more than any royal title." Sultan Khalid watched the young couple with a mixture of emotions. Surprise, certainly, but also growing approval. His daughter glowed with happiness he hadn't seen in years, and this young prince, despite his ordeal, showed signs of remarkable character. "Prince Amir," the Sultan said formally, "you've been separated from your family for months. They believe you dead or lost forever. We should send word immediately to your parents that you're alive and safe." Reality crashed back over Amir. His parents, his kingdom, everything he'd left behind, everyone who'd been grieving for him. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, please. They must be. I can't imagine what they've endured." "I'll dispatch our fastest messengers immediately," Sultan Khalid promised. "It will take several days for word to reach them, but they'll know by week's end that their son lives." Amir felt tears threatening. tears of joy, of relief, of the overwhelming emotion of knowing he would see his parents again, that their suffering would end. Jamila squeezed his hand, understanding without words the storm of feelings washing through him. "Come," the Sultan said kindly. "Let's get you out of this tower. You'll need proper rooms, clothes, food, and rest. You look exhausted, which is hardly surprising given what you've been through." As they made their way down from the tower, with Rashida already hurrying ahead to make arrangements, Amir and Jamila walked together, hands still clasped. The palace seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because Amir was seeing it through human eyes for the first time. From human height, with human perspective. They passed through the halls and emerged into the gardens that had been his sanctuary, his home for weeks. In the morning light, they were even more beautiful than he'd realized, every color more vivid, every scent more complex. "I spent so many hours here," Amir said softly, "watching from trees and rooftops, seeing the world as a bird sees it. It's strange to walk on two legs again, to see from this height. Strange but wonderful." "Was it terrible?" Jamila asked quietly. "Being trapped as a bird? I've tried to imagine it, but I can't really understand." Amir considered the question carefully. "Parts of it were terrible," he admitted. "The isolation, the inability to communicate, the constant danger, the fear that I'd never find my way back. But other parts..." He paused, searching for words. "Other parts taught me things I needed to learn, about humility, about the value of kindness, about how much we miss when we look at the world only through the lens of privilege and power." They reached the fountain where they'd spent so many evenings together, and both stopped, remembering. "I saw you differently as a bird," Amir continued. "Not as a princess to be courted for political advantage, but as a person, complex, kind, struggling with her own challenges. If I'd met you as a prince meeting a princess, would we have really seen each other? Or would we have been trapped in our roles, performing for each other instead of connecting? The curse gave us something precious, didn't it? The chance to know each other truly before knowing each other officially." "Yes," Amir agreed. And now we have both," Jamila finished. "The genuine connection we built, and the freedom to explore where it might lead without the barrier of your curse." They stood together by the fountain as the sun climbed higher, burning away the clouds, turning the morning bright and warm. Around them, the garden stirred with life, birds singing, butterflies dancing, flowers opening to the light. Somewhere in the palace, messengers were being dispatched with news that would bring joy to a kingdom far to the north. Somewhere, preparations were being made for properly welcoming a foreign prince somewhere. Rashida was reconsidering her plans, and Hassan was learning that his hopes for Jamila's hand were finally, definitively ended. But here, in the gardens, two young people stood together on the threshold of a future neither had anticipated, but both recognized as exactly right. They had traveled improbable paths to reach this moment, he through transformation and trial, she through patience and courage. And though challenges surely lay ahead, negotiations between kingdoms, questions about their future, the complexities of royal romance, for now, this moment was enough. Amir was human again. Jamila had found someone who saw her truly, and love, as Athena had promised, had proven stronger than any curse the trials were over. The real story was just beginning. Chapter 14. The Final Test. The week that followed Amir's transformation was a whirlwind of activity. Sultan Khalid had provided Amir with a suite of rooms in the palace's guest wing, clothing appropriate for a prince, and all the comforts that had been absent during his months as a bird. But Amir found himself oddly uncomfortable with such luxury after living so simply for so long. He slept on the cushioned bed but woke frequently, missing somehow the simplicity of roosting in the fig tree. He ate the rich foods prepared by palace chefs but found himself craving the straightforward satisfaction of fish caught with his own skill. He wore fine silks but remembered the freedom of feathers, the joy of flight, the unencumbered simplicity of bird life. "I'm grateful," he told Jamila one evening as they walked through the gardens, still his favorite place, though he experienced it so differently now. "But part of me misses it. Is that strange?" "Not strange at all," Jamila assured him. "You lived a completely different existence for months. That changed you. It would be stranger if you could just forget it and go back to being exactly who you were before." "I'm not who I was before," Amir admitted. "That prince, the 15-year-old who was cursed, he was privileged and sheltered. He'd never really suffered, never truly struggled. I don't think he appreciated what he had. And now I've known hunger and fear. I've been hunted and helpless. I've experienced what it's like to be dismissed as insignificant, to have no voice, no power, no way to make people listen." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "It's made me understand things I never would have otherwise. When I eventually return home and take up my responsibilities, I'll be a different kind of prince, maybe a better one." Jamila smiled. "The trials didn't just break the curse, they transformed you in ways that will last." Their conversation was interrupted by a palace guard approaching quickly. "Your Highness," he addressed Jamila, then bowed to Amir. "Prince Amir, Sultan Khalid requests your presence in the throne room immediately. Visitors have arrived." Amir and Jamila exchanged glances. Visitors? The messengers had only been gone 6 days. It was far too soon for anyone to have arrived from Amir's kingdom, even riding at speed. They hurried to the throne room, and when the doors opened, Amir's breath caught. Standing before Sultan Khalid was a figure he recognized, tall and angular, dressed in purple robes embroidered with silver symbols. Malachi, the sorcerer who had cursed him. Rage surged through Amir, hot and immediate. This man had stolen months of his life, had caused untold suffering to him and his family, had transformed him into a bird out of nothing more than petty jealousy. Every instinct screamed at Amir to attack, to demand justice, to see Malachi punished for his crimes. But Jamila's hand on his arm held him back. "Wait," she whispered. "Look at him closely." Amir forced himself to really look, and what he saw surprised him. Malachi appeared diminished somehow, his robes less lustrous, his posture less confident. More than that, his expression held something Amir had never seen there before. "Shame." "Prince Amir," Malachi said, his voice lacking its former smugness. He bowed low, a gesture of genuine respect and submission. "I have come to offer my apology and to face whatever justice you demand." "Apology?" Amir's voice shook with suppressed fury. "You cursed me. You stole months from my life. You made my parents believe I was dead. You think an apology can undo that?" "No," Malachi said quietly. "Nothing can undo what I did. But I can explain if you'll hear me, and I can offer what restitution is in my power." Sultan Khalid, who had been watching this exchange carefully, spoke. "Prince Amir, the decision is yours. I can have this man imprisoned, expelled, or executed if you wish, but I think you should hear what he has to say." Amir wanted to refuse. Every fiber of his being wanted to simply see Malachi punished and removed from his presence, but Jamila's hand still rested on his arm, steadying him, and he remembered the lessons of his trials. He had learned patience. He had learned to see beneath surfaces. He had learned that nothing was simple. "Speak," he said coldly, "but make it quick." Malachi took a breath, and when he began, his words came with obvious difficulty. "I was born with magical gifts, but no position, no family, no advantages. I spent my life accumulating power and knowledge, believing that if I could just become powerful enough, I would finally be respected, valued, loved. But power doesn't grant those things. I remained alone, envied but never truly admired. When I came to your kingdom and saw your family, the genuine love, the respect earned rather than forced, the contentment that came from connection rather than control, it enraged me. You had everything I wanted simply by accident of birth. So I cursed you, thinking it would satisfy my envy to see you suffer as I suffered." His voice dropped. "But after I cast the curse and left your kingdom, something happened that I didn't expect. Instead of satisfaction, I felt empty. Hollower than before. I had used my power for cruelty, had harmed an innocent person, and it didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel monstrous." Malachi looked directly at Amir. "I tried to convince myself I was justified, but I couldn't. So I began searching for you. To reverse what I'd done, I followed reports of an unusual Stork, tracked magical signatures, and finally traced you here. I arrived yesterday and learned that the curse had already been broken, not by my magic, but by something far more powerful, by love." "And what does this confession accomplish?" Amir asked, though his rage was cooling slightly. "Do you expect forgiveness?" "I expect nothing," Malachi said. "I deserve nothing. I came to face consequences and to offer you something that might help, though it can never compensate for what I took from you." He reached into his robes and withdrew a crystal vial containing shimmering liquid. "This is a distillation of powerful magic, everything I've learned in decades of study, condensed. It won't undo the past, but it could be used to protect someone you love, to heal wounds, to defend against magical threats. It's my power, given freely, with no strings or conditions." He placed the vial on the floor before Amir and stepped back. "Do with it, and with me, what you will. If you want me imprisoned or executed, I'll accept that judgment. If you want me to spend the rest of my life working to undo the harm I've caused, I'll do that. The choice is yours." The throne room was silent. Sultan Khalid, Rashida, the guards, Jamila, everyone waited for Amir's response. This was a test, Amir realized. Not one imposed by a curse or by fate, but one he was imposing on himself. The old Amir, the prince he'd been before the transformation, might have demanded maximum punishment, might have been satisfied by seeing his tormentor suffer. But the Amir who had spent months as a bird, who had known helplessness and fear, who had learned compassion through vulnerability, found himself thinking differently. Malachi had acted from envy and pain. The curse had been cruel and unjust, but Amir had survived it, and more than survived. He'd grown from it. The trials had made him stronger, wiser, more empathetic. They'd led him to Jamila and to understandings he never would have gained otherwise. Did that make the curse acceptable? No. Did it excuse Malachi's actions? No. But did it change what justice should look like? "I won't have you executed," Amir said slowly, and saw surprise flicker across Malachi's face. "And I won't have you imprisoned, but I will accept your offer of restitution, not the magical vial, but your service." He stepped closer to the sorcerer. "You said you spent your life accumulating power but never found connection or love. You acted from loneliness and envy. So here's what I demand. Spend the next 10 years of your life teaching magic to those who have no power, no position, no advantages, just as you once were. Use your knowledge to help people rather than harm them. Build connections through service rather than trying to force respect through displays of power. Amir glanced at Jamila, who nodded encouragingly. If you do this genuinely, if you dedicate yourself to helping rather than dominating, you might find what you were looking for all along. Not because power grants it, but because giving of yourself opens doors that manipulation never could. Malachi stared at Amir, and slowly tears began rolling down his weathered face. You offer me redemption when you could demand revenge. Why? Because revenge wouldn't heal anything, Amir said. I learned that during my trials. Bitterness and anger might feel justified, but they don't lead anywhere good. You harmed me, yes, but killing or imprisoning you won't undo that harm. Maybe rehabilitating you will at least prevent future harm and create some good in the world. He picked up the crystal vial and handed it back to Malachi. Keep your power. You'll need it for teaching, but use it wisely from now on. Malachi took the vial with shaking hands and bowed deeply. Not the false, elaborate bow of a schemer, but a genuine gesture of respect and gratitude. I will honor this trust, Prince Amir. I swear it, and I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the mercy you've shown. Sultan Khalid stood, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed. A wise judgment, Prince Amir. You show maturity beyond your years. He turned to Malachi. You may establish a school here in our kingdom if you wish. We'll provide space and resources, but you'll be monitored to ensure you honor your commitment. Thank you, Your Majesty, Malachi said. I won't fail this chance. As the sorcerer was escorted away to begin making arrangements, Jamila hugged Amir tightly. That was remarkable, she said. You turned vengeance into redemption. The curse taught me that transformation is possible, Amir replied. Not just physical transformation, but change of character. I was transformed by my trials. Maybe Malachi can be transformed by service. Sultan Khalid approached them, his expression thoughtful. Prince Amir, you continue to impress me. When word came that my daughter had fallen in love with a cursed bird, I confess I was skeptical. But I see now that fate was wiser than I could have known. You're exactly the kind of person I'd hope my daughter would choose. Principled, compassionate, wise beyond your years. He looked between them, his expression growing more serious. Which brings us to a practical matter. Your family will arrive within days. My messengers sent word that your parents departed immediately upon hearing you were alive. There will need to be discussions between our kingdoms about what comes next. About both of you. Amir and Jamila exchanged glances, and suddenly the weight of reality settled over them. Their story wasn't just personal, it had political dimensions. 2 kingdoms, 2 royal families, expectations and traditions that went back generations. Father, Jamila said carefully, I know there are protocols and procedures, but I want you to know that my feelings for Amir aren't going to change based on negotiations or arrangements. I love him, not because of any curse or magical compulsion, but because of who he is. And I love Jamila, Amir added firmly. I would have loved her even if the curse never broke, even if I remained a bird forever. Our connection isn't dependent on my being a prince or her being a princess. Sultan Khalid smiled. I believe you, and for what it's worth, I approve. But approval from a father isn't enough. Your parents will have their own thoughts, Prince Amir, and there are considerations about succession, alliances, where you'll live, how 2 kingdoms might be joined or at least closely allied. These are complicated matters. We understand, Amir said, though his heart sank slightly. He'd just regained his human form, just discovered love, and already politics was intruding. As if reading his thoughts, Sultan Khalid laughed gently. "Don't look so worried, young prince. I'm not saying any of this is impossible, just that it will require patience and negotiation, but I think you've demonstrated that you're capable of both." He clapped Amir on the shoulder. "Now, go enjoy the gardens. You've earned some peace before the next storm of activity arrives." Gratefully, Amir and Jamila escaped to their sanctuary. As they walked the familiar paths, so different now that Amir experienced them on foot rather than wing, they talked quietly about the future. "Are you afraid?" Jamila asked. "Of seeing your parents again after so long?" "Terrified," Amir admitted. "What do I even say? Sorry I've been a bird for months? How do I explain everything that's happened?" "You tell them the truth," Jamila said simply. "That you were cursed, that you suffered, that you survived, and that you came through it changed, but okay. They'll be so relieved you're alive. I don't think anything else will matter at first." "And what about us?" Amir asked quietly. "What if they don't approve? What if there are complications between our kingdoms that make a relationship impossible?" Jamila stopped walking and turned to face him, taking both his hands in hers. "Then we'll figure it out, together. I didn't fall in love with you to give up at the first obstacle. We've both been through too much to let politics defeat us." "Together," Amir echoed, and kissed her, their first real kiss as humans, full of promise and hope and a determination to fight for what they'd found. Above them, perched unseen in the branches of the fig tree where Amir had spent so many nights, a white owl watched with satisfaction. The final test had been passed, not a test imposed by curse or magic, but the test of character that matters most. Amir had chosen compassion over vengeance, redemption over retribution, growth over grievance. Athena hooted softly, a sound of approval, then spread her wings and vanished into the afternoon light. Her work truly complete now. The young couple, unaware of their mystical observer, continued their walk through the gardens, planning and dreaming, their hands clasped tight, their futures uncertain, but their commitment to each other absolute. 3 days later, dust clouds appeared on the northern road, heralding the arrival of a royal procession. Amir stood on the palace walls, watching his parents approach, his heart a mixture of joy and anxiety. Beside him, Jamila squeezed his hand reassuringly. "They love you," she reminded him. "That's all that will matter to them right now." The procession reached the palace gates, and Amir descended to meet them in the main courtyard. Sultan Khalid and his court had assembled in formal welcome. But protocol dissolved the moment Sultan Rashid and Sultana Layla saw their son. Amir's mother gave a cry that was half sob, half joy, and ran to him, all dignity forgotten. Sultan Rashid was right behind her, and within seconds, Amir was enveloped in his parents' embraces, all three of them weeping openly. "Amir, my son, my precious son," Sultana Layla kept repeating, touching his face as if to confirm he was real. "We thought you were dead. We searched everywhere, and when we found no trace, we feared the worst." "I'm alive, Mother," Amir managed through his own tears. "I'm here. I'm safe." Sultan Rashid held his son at arm's length, studying him with a father's keen eye. "You've changed," he said quietly. "You're thinner, older somehow. What happened to you, my son?" "It's a long story," Amir said, "and an impossible one, but I'll tell you everything." Over the next several hours, as both royal families gathered in a private chamber, Amir recounted his tale, the sorcerer's curse, the transformation, the months of survival as a bird, the journey that led him to this kingdom and to Jamila. He held nothing back, describing his suffering but also his growth, his despair but also his hope. His parents listened with expressions that cycled through horror, grief, wonder, and finally a kind of awed pride. "You endured all of that alone," Sultana Layla said, wiping fresh tears. "Oh, my brave boy, I can't imagine how terrified you must have been." "I was terrified," Amir admitted, "but I wasn't entirely alone." He reached for Jamila's hand. "Princess Jamila found me when I was at my lowest. She showed me kindness when I had no way to repay it. She saw past the bird form to the person beneath. She saved me in ways that had nothing to do with breaking the curse." Sultan Rashid and Sultana Layla turned their attention to Jamila, really looking at her for the first time. They saw a young woman of obvious grace and intelligence, but more than that, they saw the way she looked at their son, the way her hand fit naturally in his, the way they seemed to orbit each other even sitting still. "Princess Jamila," Sultana Layla said warmly, "it seems we owe you a debt we can never repay. You protected our son when we couldn't. You gave him friendship and love when he needed it most." "I only did what anyone with a heart would do," Jamila replied, "though I'll confess, I didn't know he was a prince when I befriended him. I thought he was just a remarkable bird who needed sanctuary." "That makes your kindness even more valuable," Sultan Rashid observed. "You cared for him without knowing his status or expecting reward. That speaks to your character, princess." He turned to Sultan Khalid. "Your daughter is extraordinary, my friend. I can see why our son has fallen in love with her." The formal acknowledgement of their relationship made both Amir and Jamila blush, but neither denied it. This was the moment of truth. Would their families support their connection, or would politics and tradition create insurmountable obstacles? The two sultans exchanged long looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sultan Khalid smiled. "I think, old friend, that fate has arranged something neither of us planned, but both of us should embrace. Our children have found each other in the most unusual circumstances imaginable. They've proven themselves worthy of each other, and an alliance between our kingdoms, sealed by a marriage of genuine love, rather than mere political convenience, would benefit both our peoples." "I agree," Sultan Rashid said, "though there are practical matters to resolve: where they'll live, how succession will be handled, what role each will play in their respective kingdoms. These are not simple questions." "No," Sultan Khalid acknowledged, "but they are solvable questions, if approached with goodwill and flexibility." For the next week, negotiations proceeded between the two families and their advisors. Amir and Jamila attended some of these discussions, but were largely left to enjoy each other's company, their parents wisely recognizing that the young couple had already proven themselves and deserved some peace. During this time, Amir reconnected with his parents in deeper ways than he'd known before his transformation. He shared with them not just what had happened, but how it had changed him. The lessons learned, the perspectives gained, the ways his understanding of leadership and responsibility had evolved. "I used to think a good ruler simply needed to be educated and make wise decisions," Amir told his father during one of their private conversations. "But now I understand that wisdom requires empathy. How can you make good decisions for people if you've never experienced vulnerability, if you've never depended on another's kindness, if you've never been powerless?" "The curse was a terrible thing," Sultan Rashid agreed, "but you've transformed it into something valuable. That's a rare gift, son. Many people who suffer become bitter. You became wiser." "I had help," Amir said, glancing toward where Jamila was walking in the gardens with his mother. "Jamila showed me what genuine goodness looks like. She had every advantage of birth and position, yet she never used her power to diminish others. She made me want to be better." Sultan Rashid followed his son's gaze and smiled. Your mother and I have been discussing the negotiations. We have a proposal to present to Sultan Khalid. The proposal, when formally presented, was elegant in its simplicity. Amir and Jamila would marry, joining the two kingdoms in alliance. They would split their time between both capitals, spending 6 months in each, learning to govern both peoples. Eventually, they would rule jointly, with Amir's younger sister, who had just turned 12, being groomed to take the northern kingdom's throne, while Amir and Jamila would rule the southern kingdom together, with provisions for their future children to inherit both realms in a united kingdom. It was unprecedented, complex, and would require years of careful transition, but both families agreed it was the best solution, one that honored both the genuine love between Amir and Jamila and the practical needs of their kingdoms. When Amir and Jamila were told of the plan, they embraced with joy and relief. They would be together. They would have purpose and partnership. The obstacles they'd feared had been transformed into opportunities. Chapter 15. New Beginnings. The wedding took place 3 months later, in the gardens where Amir and Jamila had first met, or rather, where a princess had first befriended an unusual stork. The ceremony blended traditions from both kingdoms, with guests from across the realm and beyond attending to witness this union born of such extraordinary circumstances. Amir stood at the altar in formal robes, watching Jamila approach, and his heart swelled with love and gratitude. She was beautiful, of course, but that wasn't what moved him. It was knowing who she truly was beneath the silk and jewels, the woman who had talked to a bird as an equal, who had defended him against guards and advisors, who had seen him at his most vulnerable and loved him anyway. Jamila, walking toward Amir, felt similarly overcome. This was the stork she'd protected, now restored to his true form, but carrying with him all the qualities she'd fallen in love with: his gentleness, his courage, his capacity for growth and forgiveness. The ceremony was conducted by a priest from each kingdom, symbolizing the union of 2 realms as well as 2 people. When they exchanged vows, both spoke words they'd written themselves. "I promise to always see you truly," Jamila vowed, "not just as a prince or a husband, but as the soul I came to know in the gardens. I promise to offer you the same acceptance you offered me. Love without conditions, partnership without pretense. I promise to cherish the gift you gave me," Amir responded, "the gift of being seen and valued as I truly am. I promise to never forget the lessons I learned during my trials, to rule with compassion, to remember that every person, regardless of status, deserves dignity and kindness." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the assembled guests erupted in celebration. But for just a moment, before turning to face their well-wishers, Amir and Jamila looked up at the sky above the gardens. A white owl circled there once, twice, 3 times, then flew off toward the horizon, leaving behind a single feather that spiraled down to land at their feet. Jamila picked it up, and she and Amir exchanged smiles. Athena's blessing, they understood. The mystical guide who had orchestrated so much was giving her approval to their union. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days: feasting, music, dancing, and storytelling. Malachi attended, by invitation, and formally apologized to Amir's parents for the curse he'd cast. He also presented them with a gift, a detailed chronicle of Amir's trials that he'd created using magic to observe and record, which explained how he'd found Amir in the first place. "I watched him struggle and grow," Malachi told Sultan Rashid and Sultana Layla. "I saw every moment of his suffering, and I've never been more ashamed of anything in my life. But I also saw his courage, his resilience, his capacity for compassion, even when he had every reason to be bitter. "Your son is remarkable, and I'm honored that he gave me a chance at redemption." The sorcerer had already begun his school, taking in students with magical talent, but no means to develop it. His first class of 5 students attended the wedding, and their obvious devotion to their teacher showed that Malachi was indeed transforming his life. During the celebration, Amir found a quiet moment to visit the fig tree where he'd spent so many nights as a stork. He stood beneath its branches, remembering what it had felt like to roost there, to see the world from that perspective, to be something other than human. Jamila found him there. "Having second thoughts about walking on 2 legs?" she teased gently. "No," Amir laughed. "Though I do sometimes miss being able to fly. There was a freedom to it that's hard to explain. Maybe someday you can experience it again," Jamila suggested, "not as a curse, but as a choice. Malachi might be able to create a temporary transformation spell, one you could control, that you could use to fly when you wanted, but always return from." Amir considered this, intrigued by the idea. "I'd like that, to revisit that form without the fear and helplessness, to choose to see the world from that perspective." "Then we'll make it happen," Jamila promised. She took his hand. "Come on, your mother wants to make a toast, and your father is about to embarrass you with stories from your childhood." They returned to the celebration, to laughter and love, to family and friends, to a future that promised both challenges and joy. And if sometimes Amir found himself looking at the sky with longing, if sometimes he missed the simplicity of bird life, if sometimes he felt the phantom sensation of wings on his back, well, those were small prices to pay for everything he'd gained. Epilogue. 5 years later. 5 years after the curse was broken, the United Kingdom of Rashid Khalid flourished under the joint rule of King Amir and Queen Jamila. They had indeed split their time between the 2 capitals, but the frequent travel had brought unexpected benefits. It kept them connected to both peoples, prevented either capital from feeling neglected, and made them far more accessible than traditional monarchs. Their governing style reflected the lessons Amir had learned during his transformation. They established programs to help the most vulnerable citizens, the poor, the sick, those without voice or power. They created sanctuaries not just for wildlife but for people who needed refuge. They ruled with a combination of wisdom and compassion that made them beloved by their subjects. They had 2 children now, a daughter named Layla after Amir's mother, and a son named Khalid after Jamila's father. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, and they loved to visit the gardens where a stork had once befriended a princess. The gardens themselves had become a kind of pilgrimage site for people from across the realm and beyond. The fig tree where Amir had roosted was considered sacred, and couples in love would often visit to leave offerings and make wishes for relationships as true as the one between their king and queen. Malachi's school had grown substantially. Dozens of students studied there now, learning magic but also ethics, compassion, and responsibility. The old sorcerer had become genuinely beloved, proof that redemption was possible for even the most fallen souls. One evening, as Amir and Jamila walked through the gardens they both still loved, watching their children play near the fountains, Jamila asked the question she occasionally returned to. "Do you ever regret it? The curse, I mean. I know it was terrible, but it led to everything we have now. Do you wish it had never happened?" Amir considered carefully, as he always did when she asked. "I regret the suffering it caused my parents. I regret the months they spent grieving, thinking I was dead. I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone." He paused, watching a white stork land in the shallows of the nearest pool. Storks visited regularly now, as if recognizing that these gardens were a place of safety and magic. But for myself, I don't think I can regret it. That person I was before the curse, he was fine, but he was limited. He'd never really struggled, never had to depend on others' kindness, never had to see the world from any perspective but privilege. The trials transformed me in ways that have made me a better person, a better ruler, and, I hope, a better husband and father. And most importantly, they led me to you. Not in the formal, arranged way most royal marriages happen, but in a way that let us truly know each other. Jamila leaned against him, content. I think about it sometimes, too. What if you'd come to our kingdom as a prince instead of a stork? Would we have connected? Or would we have been too aware of our roles, too concerned with impressions and protocols? I think we might have eventually found our way to each other, Amir said. But it would have taken longer and been more complicated. The curse gave us something precious, the chance to build our foundation on truth rather than pretense. Their daughter Layla called out to them, excited about a butterfly she'd found. Amir and Jamila went to admire it, pointing out its colors and patterns, teaching her about the ecosystem of the gardens, just as Jamila had once taught Amir. As the sun set over the palace and the gardens began their transformation into evening beauty, Amir felt a profound sense of gratitude. His life hadn't followed the path anyone expected. He'd been cursed, transformed, exiled, and tested in ways most princes never experienced. But those trials had led him to love, to wisdom, to a life of meaning and purpose. They'd taught him that identity isn't fixed, that we can lose ourselves and find ourselves again, that transformation can be a gift even when it arrives disguised as a curse, that the person we become matters more than the person we were born to be. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, an owl hooted. Just a normal owl, probably. But Amir chose to hear it as a reminder Athena had told him to trust the journey, to remain himself, to let love show the way. He had trusted. He had remained true to his core even while everything else changed. And love had indeed shown the way, not just to breaking the curse, but to a life richer and more authentic than any he could have imagined. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed his transformation so long ago, Amir whispered a silent thank you to fate, to magic, to the trials that had broken him down and built him back stronger, and most of all to the princess who had seen a stork and recognized the soul within. The curse was broken, the trials were complete, but the story, the real story of growth and love and transformation, would continue for all the years to come, written not in magic but in the daily choices to see clearly, to love deeply, and to remain, always truly, themselves. The end author's note: The Stork Prince is a tale about transformation in its many forms, physical, emotional, and spiritual. While Amir's curse forces an external change, the real transformation happens within, as trials strip away pretense and privilege to reveal true character. The story explores themes of identity, who we are when everything external is taken away, compassion, the power of kindness offered without expectation of reward, and redemption, the possibility of change even for those who have caused harm. May we all have the courage to embrace transformation when it comes, even when it arrives in forms we never expected or wanted. And may we all find someone who sees us truly and loves us anyway, for that is the magic that breaks every curse.